Welcome into Survivor Analytics. I am your host, Clyde, and today I will be walking through my ranking of every winning game in the history of US Survivor. This is a project that I've been wanting to make for a long time, but before jumping into the list, it's important to cover some of the ground rules. Everyone ranks Survivor winners differently, so for me, there were three big factors directing my ranking. First, there's strategic dominance. In other words, how much control did a particular winner hold in navigating the season? Further, how did the winner wield that power to their advantage? Were they capable of identifying the optimal path to a win? It's important to acknowledge out of the gate here that historically there are social barriers in place for contestants attempting a dominant play style. Especially in the early seasons of the show, we see primarily men take on this approach. With recent winners like Dee on Survivor 45, I think we are getting closer to a point where anyone can play a strategically dominant game. I understand that some people hate ranking Survivor winners based on dominance due to those societal factors, but it's the kind of ranking that I'm personally most interested in. If you want to rank Survivor winners based on another set of criteria, you are more than welcome to do so. The second big factor in my ranking is social insulation. In my opinion, the best Survivor winners are those who maintain loyal allies such that they are safe regardless of the outcome of immunity challenges. Throughout this ranking, you will hear me knock players for needing challenge wins or needing idol plays. Obviously, the ability to win a challenge or utilize an idol correctly are positive attributes for a player assessment, but when I'm looking strictly at winning games, I ideally want to see winners who avoided the target in its entirety. It's also worth acknowledging that relying on challenges or idols puts more power into the decisions of production. Different challenges play to different strengths, so by relying on challenges to reach the end, there's an element of luck in that players are hoping that production selects a challenge that they can win. Yes, there is luck in the social strategy side of Survivor as well, but I feel that component of the game puts more power into the players themselves. The last major criteria for my ranking is win equity. I value this component the least as there's a theoretical element when it comes to win equity. Obviously, all of these winners receive the necessary jury votes on their particular seasons, but I think it's important to at least consider the other possible final tribal council combinations. Some of the best Survivor winners are those who win a jury vote regardless of who they sit next to in the end. With all the criteria out of the way, we can jump into the list, and I've actually organized all of these contestants according to 9 separate tiers. This first tier includes contestants that fall into one of 3 buckets. You have the winners that relied on production-infused twists, you have winners that relied on extended immunity win streaks, and you got winners that were just clueless for most of the season. So at 47, the worst winner in the history of Survivor, to no one's surprise, is Chris Underwood from Survivor Edge of Extinction. When I started developing this ranking, I had a feeling that Chris would rank towards the bottom for the simple fact that he is the only winner in Survivor history to win the show after getting voted out. That fact alone dropped Chris to this bottom section of the list, as he fundamentally failed in the game's central goal of surviving each tribal council. What's even worse, though, are the logistics surrounding Chris's first elimination, as he's voted out due to his own poor play. When Chris's Manu tribe loses their 3rd straight immunity challenge, that group is initially prepared to take out Wendy, who hid the tribe's flint and injured her ankle. Theoretically, Chris should have had no issues surviving that round. His name isn't even on the board until he tries flipping the vote onto Wentworth, and through that attempt, the rest of the tribe bands together against him. Once voted out of the game, Chris's Survivor legacy is essentially saved through circumstances outside his control with the introduction of the Edge of Extinction twist. That gimmick provided Chris with a massive advantage, as he could sit out of the game for the next 27 days and connect with future members of the jury. By the time Chris returned to Survivor on day 35, he held an exact blueprint of how to win the season. He knew exactly who needed to go home at Final 6, Final 5, and Final 4. Every other winner on this list did not have the luxury of engaging with jury members following their eliminations. They needed to create that winning game plan without assistance from the jury itself. When Chris returns to the game at Final 6, I still don't think that he plays particularly well en route to the end. At Final 6, he convinces Lauren to waste her idol on him, which is probably his best strategic move of the season. At Final 5, Chris only survives through a successful idol play, On one hand, you can credit Chris for identifying himself as the target, but on the other hand, that idol was only valid through that round. Playing it in that spot was a no-brainer. Let's also not forget that Chris was handed that idol from production as a reward for returning to the game through the Edge of Extinction. This means that when Chris comes back at Final 6, he only needs to survive one straightforward tribal council. Even though Chris gets the flashy moment of playing his idol in front of the jury, the fact that Chris needed the idol to begin with is a major negative on his resume. Then at the Final 4, Chris makes the big move of throwing himself into fire-making against Rick Devens, which, again, I don't find very impressive considering that Chris knew about Devens' high jury stock through his conversations on the Edge. So I look at Chris's win as one that is very dependent on the influence of production. When writing this list, I was open to ranking Chris somewhere else in the bottom tier, but given the mistakes in his elimination round, as well as his decisions upon returning to the game, I had no other choice but to place him here at number 47. On to number 46, we have a player from one of Survivor's most chaotic seasons in Bob Crowley, the winner of Survivor Gabon. On the surface, I think Bob's game is one where he's poorly positioned every step of the way, and in spite of that underdog status, he's never fully respected by the jury. That lack of win equity is the major factor that dropped Bob to 46, below the winner that we will discuss at 45. So Bob starts the season on the Coda tribe, where he works his way into the majority 5-person alliance, but unbeknownst to Bob, he's number 5 in that group. By the tribe swap section of the game, Bob is actually pushed out of the alliance in its entirety as Randy takes his spot. Amidst these shifting alliance dynamics, Bob remains completely oblivious. In fact, he intended on rolling with that original Coda alliance into the merge where, if they took control of the numbers, Bob is the first player they would have cut from their group. In a weird way, Bob benefits from the second tribe swap that knocks Marcus out of the game, as it prevents him from following his initial plan of riding with the Coda players. From the Marcus vote at the final 10 onwards, Bob is on the bottom with no real strategic agency. He loses all of his Coda allies between the final 10 and the final 7. During that stretch, Bob makes some ridiculous decisions that actively burn his relationships with members of the jury, the most notable being him crafting a fake idol for Randy. The only positive in that section of Bob's game is his threat level management. The fact that Marcus, Charlie, Randy, and Corinne are all targeted before Bob can be seen as a positive, but I don't think that Bob's survival was really due to anything intentional on his end. I think that Bob was simply perceived as a non-threat, which is later confirmed as he barely wins the season against Susie and Sugar, two of the worst finalists in the history of the show. At Final 6 and Final 5, Bob is a bottom feeder whose entire game is dependent on winning individual immunities. Without immunity in either of those rounds, Bob gets voted out. The Final 4 is one of the few shining lights in Bob's game as he loses individual immunity, and it initially looks like he's the consensus target. At the 11th hour, though, Sugar steps in. She aligns with Bob and gives him a fighting chance in fire-making against Maddie. I'd love to give Bob credit for this last-minute alliance with Sugar, but I feel that their connection was more so based out of Sugar's life experiences rather than the active work of Bob himself. Prior to the filming of Gabon, Sugar's father passed away, and Bob presented himself as a parental figure to Sugar. Anyways, Bob wins that fire-making challenge against Maddie, but it's important to note that Bob intended on running with Maddie to the final tribal council, where he would have lost. As mentioned earlier, Bob narrowly wins the season against Susie and Sugar, who were widely perceived as two of the worst players in the eyes of the jury. Bob receives 4 out of 7 jury votes, one of which came from Randy, who Bob burned on the way out. The fact that Susie came 1 vote away from winning this season is absolutely absurd. I don't think that Bob had much win equity on Gabon. I believe that he loses the season in most other final tribal council combinations. He for sure loses to Maddie, who places 4th, as well as Kenny, who placed 5th. So Bob's game is one where he's constantly operating from the bottom and making incorrect reads from that position. There are other Survivor winners who work outside the majority, but they rank ahead of Bob due to their ability to flip the game in their favor. So out of those winners who were not voted out, I see Bob as the worst of the bunch. He ranks here at 46. On to number 45, we got a winner whose game is similar to Bob's in that he's perpetually on the bottom of his main alliance, and by the end game, he's completely isolated and relying on immunity wins. It's the sole survivor of Survivor Nicaragua, Fabio. Fabio's win is a sloppy game from beginning to end. Out of the gate, he's on the outside of the LaFleur tribe as he's excluded from the Shannon vote. At the tribe swap, Fabio is switched into a group where his original alliance holds the numbers advantage, so he's in a solid spot there. During that swap section of the game, Fabio establishes an alliance with Marty, and he proceeds to lose Marty 2 rounds later at the final 11. And from that point forward, Fabio is on the bottom with no real strategic agency. He also gets very lucky with the double quit at the final 9 and the final 8. With Nyanka and Purple Kelly quitting the game, Fabio is essentially pushed 2 rounds closer to the final tribal. There is a world where, without that double quit, Fabio goes home in that mid-merge section of the game. Then at Final 7, Fabio's group fails to pull Sash onto their side, and he's excluded from the Benry blind side. By the time we hit the Final 6, Fabio is the consensus target, and he needs 3 straight individual immunity wins to reach the final tribal council. When Fabio sits at the end against Chase and Sash, he squeaks out the win, picking up 5 out of 9 jury votes. That win equity is the main factor pushing Fabio ahead of Bob in my ranking. Unlike Bob, Fabio wins most other final tribal council combinations. He probably beats Holly, who places 4th, or Dan, who places 5th. I'd also say that while Bob and Fabio were both positioned on the bottom, I feel that Fabio made fewer active mistakes from that spot. Fabio claims that he put on this persona of the clueless surfer bro, but I feel that he just didn't know what was going on for most of the season. And in those times where he was included in the vote, he was pulled over as a number. He never held much agency in actually directing the season. Combine that lack of control with his reliance on challenges, and I'll put Fabio here at number 45. On to number 44, we have another winner who greatly benefited from production interference. This is a player that I considered ranking as low as 46, if not for his control in the early game. But anyways, here at 44, I have Ben Driebergen, the winner of Survivor Heroes versus Healers versus Hustlers. Everyone remembers Ben for the 2 luck-based scenarios surrounding his winning game. First, you have Ben finding 3 immunity idols that help him bulldoze his way from the final 7 to the final 4. Throughout that entire stretch, Ben is on the bottom, and without those idols, he's voted out of the game. The second lucky component in Ben's win is obviously the introduction of the forced fire-making challenge. At Final 4, Ben loses individual immunity, and it looks like he's dead to rights. Every remaining player was prepared to vote against Ben, but production introduces that twist, which gives Ben a second life. I don't have an issue with fire-making in later seasons because those players knew about the gimmick beforehand. The cast of Triple H could not game plan around forced fire-making, which greatly plays to Ben's benefit given his constant operation on the bottom. Those lucky factors automatically drop Ben to this bottom tier of the list, and his actively bad decisions in the second half of the game are what land him this low within that bottom tier. With 3 idols in the post-merge, Ben could theoretically control the season, but he oftentimes uses those idols ineffectively. His idol play at the final 7 is easily his best as he takes Lauren out with a single vote. At Final 6, he plays his idol before the votes are even cast. First, the fact that production allowed Ben to play the idol early is just ridiculous, but second, by playing that idol early, Ben loses the element of surprise. He tries to rally the other players against Mike, and he completely fails as Ashley goes home. Then at Final 5, Ben saves himself again with an idol, but he's unable to take Devin out of the game. Ben's reliance on idols, as well as his decisions with those idols, are really bad. The primary factor boosting Ben ahead of Bob and Fabio is his control in the first half of the season. Ben's game prior to the Final 7 is respectable. He starts Triple H well positioned on the Heroes tribe. At the merge, he works within the majority in taking out the Healers for 3 straight rounds. At Final 9, Ben operates as a secret agent, pretending to align with the likes of Ryan and Chrissy, only to flip against them in the following round. It's not a dominant performance by any means, but it's one where Ben is constantly in the loop. I think Ben spends much less of the season scraping by on the bottom than those other winners below him on the list. As mentioned earlier, Ben loses control at Final 7, but I don't think he made many active mistakes to cause that loss of agency. I think the other players did not want to ride with Ben to the end due to his background. As a former Marine, Ben defined the hero label for the season, and people didn't want to compete against that storyline. You can also credit Ben in terms of win equity, as he probably beats anyone from the final 7 onwards in a jury vote. So like I said earlier, I really considered ranking Ben as the second worst winner of Survivor due to the fire-making challenge incident, but his gameplay up until his downfall at the final 7 was strong enough to earn him the number 44 spot. At 43, we have a winner who I feel is generally overrated by the Survivor community. I did not find this contestant's winning game all that impressive when she first won her season, and my opinion has not changed much over time. It's Michele Fitzgerald from Survivor Co. Wrong. Michelle's win checks the same boxes as the other winners in this tier. She works on the bottom for most of the season, she relies on immunity wins to reach the final tribal council, and she has some incredibly lucky breaks in her game that ultimately facilitate her win. So from the beginning, Michele is on the outside of the beauty tribe, and while the edit hypes up this dynamic of the men versus the women, it's been reported after the season that Michele and Nick were positioned on the bottom. Had Michelle's tribe lost immunity in those first 5 episodes, she's in serious danger. Now, you can partially credit Michele for her contributions in tribal challenges, but you need to admit that there are other factors at play there. Michele does not attend a tribal council for the entire pre-merge, which again is very lucky. It's something we rarely see through the history of the show. At the merge, Michele is initially in the majority, contributing to the Nick and Debbie votes, but she doesn't hold much control in that section of the game. Aubrey and Sydney are really the ones running the show there. Then at Final 8, Michele is left out of the plan to knock out Scott Pollard, and from that point forward, she's completely powerless. At Final 7, she loses her number 1 ally in Julia. Michele contributes to that vote and later props up this move at the final tribal as the moment that helped her integrate within the majority, but that's not really true. The opposing alliance targets Michele multiple times after the Julia boot. At Final 6, Michele is used as the backup plan in the Jason vote, so that stretch between the Final 8 and Final 6 is pretty bad for her in terms of her lack of strategic agency, but I will credit Michele for her threat level management. Michele had positioned herself as the lowest possible threat amidst those players on the bottom. Unfortunately, by the Final 5, Michele is clearly presented as the biggest target on the board, and she relies on a Joe medical evacuation and an immunity win to reach the final tribal. That entire saga surrounding the Joe medevac is the biggest knock against Michele's winning game. When Joe gets pulled from the season for overeating on reward, the Final 5 immunity challenge turns into the Final 4 reward challenge. Michele loses that challenge to Aubrey, meaning if Joe stays on the island, Michele is vulnerable at Final 5 in a spot where she's more than likely taken out. So long story short, the Joe medical evacuation saves Michele and pushes her just one immunity challenge away from winning the season. At Final 4, Michele wins both immunity and the juror removal advantage. She makes a correct read in removing Neil from the jury as an obvious pro-Aubrey vote, but it's important to acknowledge that Michele fails to even achieve her ideal Final Tribal Council combination. Michele intended on taking Aubrey out at Final 4, but she's unable to pull Ty onto her side. That results in a fire-making challenge between Aubrey and Sydney, which Aubrey wins. Granted, Michele wins a jury vote against either Aubrey or Sydney, so that round was not detrimental to her game, but it's still another instance of Michele failing to take control. The only positive I see with Michelle's endgame is her win equity, as she beats any other player at the Final 5. And while that win equity is impressive, I think the route to victory is very rocky. Michele has numerous lucky scenarios that play out on this season, like her challenge success in the pre-merge, as well as the Joe medical evacuation. It's an uninspiring win in my book. I'll rank her here at 43. On to number 42, we have a winner whose game is largely defined by immunity wins. I think this contestant has a serious argument for the best winning physical game in Survivor history, but the rest of this run leaves a lot to be desired. It's Mike Holloway, the winner of Survivor Worlds Apart. Out of every winner discussed so far, Mike might be the worst in terms of his threat level management. Through his hyper-aggressive play at the auction, Mike isolates himself from the rest of the cast, and he needs immunity every round starting at the final 9. Unlike some of the winners discussed earlier like Ben, Mike's positioning on the bottom is entirely his own doing. Now, to his credit, Mike bulldozes his way to the final tribal from the final 9 through more traditional means than a winner like Ben. He wins 5 individual immunities and plays an idol correctly at the final 7. At the same time, though, the fact that Mike needed immunity through most of the merge reveals an inherent flaw with his game. Mike never built the social bonds necessary to carry him through the post-merge. In fact, you can make the argument that outside of Chris Underwood, Mike is the worst winner on this list, strictly in terms of strategic positioning. With all that in mind, I still think that Mike plays well both within the majority in the pre-merge and on the bottom in the post-merge. In the first half of the game, he works within the main power structure on the Eskameka tribe, aligning with the likes of Rodney, Dan, and Kelly. At the tribe swap, Mike gets an upper hand over Rodney by flipping the vote onto Joaquin. Then in the early merge, Mike works as a central member of the majority in picking off members of the no-collar tribe between the final 11 and the final 10. When Mike's primary alliance turns against him at the final 9, he still finds a way to impact the game on a strategic level. Mike is a distinct winner in that regard. Most other contestants who rely on challenges in the endgame generally forfeit all strategic agency. Mike continues to influence the direction of the season despite his poor positioning. He threatens to play an idol at Final 8, which reveals the cracks of the dominant alliance. At Final 7, Mike solidifies an alliance with Carolyn, and he holds substantial agency in pulling Sierra onto their side to vote out Tyler. Then at Final 5, Mike serves as the essential swing vote that knocks out Sierra. All of this is to say that through that back section of the game, Mike finds a way to control the vote while on the bottom. I'd also note that Mike was very aware of his status as the biggest threat, and he intentionally knocks out other challenge beasts as a way to improve his own chances of winning out. So Mike's win on Worlds Apart is definitely a flawed victory. It's an all-time bad performance from a positioning perspective, but when accounting for his agency throughout the season, I will rank Mike here at 42. On to number 41, I have the most recent winner of Survivor in Rachel from Survivor 47. Throughout our coverage of 47, I was never high on Rachel's game. In the final tribal council of that season, Andy compares Rachel's performance to the likes of Mike Holloway and Ben Driebergen. I completely agree with that assessment, and all 3 of them ranked in this bottom tier. I actually considered ranking Rachel below Mike for the simple reason that she held less control. At least with Mike, he ran the pre-merge section of the game. I don't know if there's a real stretch on 47 where Rachel is directing the season. More often than not, she's out of the loop, and other players don't want to work with her. When Rachel gains agency in 47, it's typically through production-infused advantages, not her social gameplay. The main reason why I put Rachel ahead of Mike is her threat level management. Neither one of these winners are strong in that arena, but Rachel is slightly better. Mike is the consensus target every round starting at the final 9, and that does not happen for Rachel until the final 7. So taking a deeper look, Rachel is initially in the majority on the Gada tribe in their first tribal council, but she then falls outside the main power structure. She's blindsided in their second tribal council, where she loses her number 1 ally in Annika. I think that Rachel deserves a lot of criticism for that round. Postseason, Sierra reported that she elected to flip against them because Rachel and Annika presented themselves as an obvious pair. Moving on to the merge, you got the split tribal at Final 12, where Rachel is initially swapped into a horrible position as she's outnumbered 5-1 by the opposing Tuku alliance. It's an unlucky spot for her, and leading up to tribal council, it looks like we're headed towards a unanimous Rachel vote. She's then saved by factors completely outside her own control, with Saul playing the take-your-pick advantage. Now, you could credit Rachel for her connection to Saul, but I see this move more so as anti-Tuku rather than pro-Rachel. I think that Saul would have made the same decision regardless of which non-Tuku member was sitting in Rachel's spot. At the end of the day, I still look at this round as a slight negative for Rachel because she was nearly voted out. Plus, there are other winners far ahead of Rachel on the list who received similar swaps, and they survived purely through their social gameplay. In the early merge, Rachel works outside the majority alliance. She loses 2 of her allies back-to-back in Sierra and Saul. She has a solid shot in the dark play at Final 11, which saves her idol for later in the post-merge. That move improves my opinion of Rachel, the Survivor player, but it still occurs in a spot where she's losing control of the game. Around the Final 8, Rachel turns her game around. She builds this 5-person underdog alliance where she's positioned in the middle. She volunteers for a journey to prevent the players on the bottom from acquiring an advantage. She gets lucky there in that she wins a 1 out of 3 rock draw to acquire a vote block, but then we get to the Final 7, which is an absolute disaster for Rachel. She's the original target of Operation Italy, where without immunity, she's potentially taken out. She's then blindsided by the Caroline vote, which basically breaks her game. Following that move, Rachel loses the trust of Teenie, and she's on the bottom for the rest of the season. If Rachel is vulnerable in any subsequent round, she's voted out. At Final 6, we see Rachel take out Andy through an idol play, which impresses the jury. It's important to note that, according to postseason interviews, Sue was the one really campaigning against Andy while Rachel wanted to knock out Sam. It's great that Rachel takes the credit for that Andy boot, but it's another instance of Rachel not really directing the ship. From that point forward, Rachel wins out. She makes the correct moves at Final 5 in taking out Genevieve and Final 4 in not stepping into firemaking. She then reaches the final tribal against Sam and Sue, where she wins in a 7-1-0 jury vote. I gotta give Rachel a lot of credit for her general win equity. I think that Rachel beats just about anyone in the end, outside maybe Genevieve. So overall, I think that Rachel's win showcases a lot of great skills for a Survivor player, but I wouldn't describe it as a strategically dominant victory. Like the other winners in this tier, it's a game where Rachel depends on immunities and works primarily outside the majority alliance. It's the worst winning game of the new era. It's here at number 41. At number 40, I have a winner whose game is similar to Mike's and Rachel's in that she needed to win out, but those immunity challenge wins were not necessary until much later in the season. It's Jenna Morasca, the winner of Survivor the Amazon. I've never been particularly high on Jenna's winning game, and to be honest, I was surprised when I finished the list and found that there were 7 winners below her. There's 2 main issues that I take with Jenna's win. The first is obviously her reliance on immunity wins. Jenna is on the bottom starting at the Final 4. She is in a spot for 2 straight rounds where she goes home without the immunity necklace. The second issue is her resilience within the game. Many people forget this, but Jenna reaches a breaking point around the Final 5, and she genuinely considers quitting the show. I will admit, though, that Jenna was well positioned for most of the season up until the Final 7 where she loses control. In the pre-merge, she carves out a spot in the majority of the Tambaki tribe. At the swap, she connects with Alex and Rob, which pays dividends later in the season. Then in the early merge, Jenna is a central figure of the Young Person Alliance, which runs that section of the game, taking out the likes of Roger, Dave, and Dina. By the time Jenna reaches the Final 7, she's sitting in a great spot at the core of a 4-person majority. Unfortunately for Jenna, her ally Alex tells Rob that he's number 4 in their alliance, which causes Rob to flip against that group. He votes out Alex at Final 7, blindsiding Jenna in the process. From that point forward, Jenna is on the bottom with no real control in the game. But it's important to recognize that if Rob stayed loyal at Final 7, Jenna had a clear path to the Final 3 with Alex and Heidi. Now, I don't know if Jenna beats either of them in a jury vote, but it's impressive that there was the potential there for a deep run. Even when Jenna is pushed to the periphery of the tribe, she does some solid work from that spot. At Final 6, she wins individual immunity and passes the necklace to Heidi, which preserves Heidi as a shield for an additional round. Keep in mind that Jenna loses immunity at Final 5, so without this move, there is a chance that Heidi goes out at 6 and Jenna goes out at 5. I'd also credit Jenna for her social work at the Final 3, where her connection with Matt leads him to intentionally throw the final immunity challenge because he does not want to be the player that votes out Rob. Jenna ends up beating Matt in a 6-1 jury vote, which actually undersells her winning stock since, Matt is Matt. Jenna had 2 contestants on the jury in Alex and Heidi who would vote for her in any combination. Jenna was a real jury threat, and even if she somehow faced off against the season's best player in Rob in the final tribal, I think it's a very close vote. In that scenario, Jenna has the locked votes of Alex and Heidi, while Rob gets Dina, Matthew, and Butch. The season's winner is essentially determined by the jury votes of Dave and Chrissy, so who knows what happens there. So when I look at Jenna's game at large, I feel that she escaped the bottom 5 of the list due to her lesser reliance on production interference and immunity wins. Every winner ranked below Jenna was either saved through game-breaking twists or survived through a longer immunity win streak. It's still a rough win in the context of Survivor history, but it's strong enough to earn Jenna the number 40 spot. On to number 39, we are entering the second tier of my ranking that I'm calling ineffective under the radar. This next collection contains players who operated within the majority alliance, but they lacked agency within that group. Some of these players were straight up excluded from plans concocted by their main allies. Others developed their own strategic ideas, but they failed to push the season in that direction. So here at number 39, we have a contestant that I'm generally lower on in terms of her actual player quality. This is one of the legends of Survivor, but I never found either of her winning games all that impressive. It's Sandra Diaz-Twine with her run on Season 20 Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. I already know that people will want to see Sandra ranked higher on the list due to her status as this iconic 2-time winner. But if you put a magnifying glass up to Sandra's winning games, you will find a lot of holes, especially in her second victory. I look at Sandra's win on Season 20 as one where she's poorly positioned in the first half, and in the second half, she earns the title of sole survivor by failing in her strategic misreads. So, from the beginning, Sandra starts this season on the Villains tribe, where she's initially in the majority power structure led by Rob Mariano. That alliance controls the early rounds of the game until the point where Tyson basically votes himself out, as Russell tricks him into flipping his vote onto Parvati. After that move, Russell gains the trust of Coach and Jerry, which positions Sandra on the bottom of the Villains. For the rest of the season, Sandra operates on the periphery of her alliance with no real control. She loses Boston Rob at the following Villains Tribal Council. Then at Final 12, Sandra pulls off what many consider her best move of the season as she plays on Russell's paranoia and deceives him into taking out Coach over herself or her ally Courtney. While Sandra likely held some influence over that decision, I think Russell went through with that vote as a way to maintain this image of an all-women's alliance. Throughout the pre-merge of this season, Russell works to gain the trust of the Heroes tribe by voting out all of the men, and by doing so, he presents himself as an outsider. Voting out Coach was essential to that plan, so I question Sandra's real impact in that tribal council. Later on at the merge, Sandra adapts this anti-Russell sentiment where she constantly attempts and fails to push the vote in that direction. Sandra tries to rally the heroes against Russell at the final 10, the final 9, and the final 6. Obviously, Sandra's lack of agency in that stretch is a knock against her resume, but what's even worse is the fact that Sandra wanted to take out Russell in the first place. She straight up fails to identify Russell as a player that would carry her to the end and burn jury votes in the process. Voting out Russell would be terrible for Sandra's game. Had she succeeded in that goal, she forfeits the numbers to the heroes, who would likely stick together and pick off every villain. While Sandra is probably the last villain standing in that scenario, she still gets taken out around 6th place. In reality, by failing to gather the numbers against Russell, he takes control of the game and elects to drag Sandra to the final tribal where she beats him. Now, to Sandra's credit, she eventually pinpoints Russell's low jury stock and adapts her plan accordingly, but that realization for Sandra comes very late in the post-merge. So I understand the surface-level draw with Sandra's Heroes vs. Villains game, as it is the season that crowned her as the franchise's first 2-time winner. For me, though, I don't look at this run as a very impressive victory. It's one where Sandra constantly works against her best interest, and by failing in those strategic misreads, she stumbles into a win. Now, Sandra never depends on immunity wins or production-based twists, which at least elevates her out of the bottom tier in my ranking. With that said, I feel that this game best defines the overarching tier of ineffective under-the-radar players. Sandra avoided the target for most of the season, but she played suboptimally from the shadows. She ranks here at number 39. Headed over to number 38, where, to my surprise, I have the same player in Sandra Diaz-Twine, this time with her first winning game on Survivor Pearl Islands. I always considered Sandra's Pearl Islands run the more impressive of the two, but I didn't expect them to rank back-to-back. Like her Heroes vs. Villains game, Sandra works under the radar for most of the season, and she often benefits from failing to achieve her desired outcome. This win ranks ahead of her other victory because there are more moments where Sandra actively makes the correct strategic move, especially in the late game. So early on, Sandra is a member of the Drake tribe, where she initially finds herself on the outside of that group. In fact, it's been reported after the season that if Drake lost the first immunity challenge, Sandra is likely the first boot. It's important to remember that Drake barely wins that relay race in the premiere, which essentially saves Sandra's entire Survivor legacy. Through that pre-merge section of the game, Sandra locks down her main alliance with Rupert and Krista. That trio runs the Drake tribe, voting out the likes of Burton, Trish, and Sean. While Sandra is well positioned for that stretch, I think she relies heavily on her allies to do most of the strategic legwork. This is especially evident at the Trish boot, where Rupert is the one pulling Sean onto their side. The Outcast twist in episode 8 serves as a major luck-based boost to Sandra's game, in that the two players who return to the island are Burton and Lil. Burton held no ill will towards his former Drake tribe, while Lil felt burned by the members of the Morgan tribe. Sandra had no control over who came back into the game, and she gets very lucky in that both returnees align with her side, giving them the numbers advantage. Looking beyond the returning players, the existence of the Outcast twist itself kind of saves Sandra's long-term trajectory. Without that twist, Sandra's tribe enters the merge alongside Sean, who was prepared to flip over to work with the Morgans. In that scenario, the Morgans take control of the game, and Sandra is likely voted out somewhere between the final 10 and the final 7. In reality, the Drake tribe takes control in the early merge, as Fairplay and Rupert work as the lead strategists in pulling Burton and Lil back into their alliance. It's another instance of Sandra directly benefiting from the work of her allies. The Drake majority remains in control until the final 8, where Sandra's game completely falls off the rails. In that round, Fairplay and Burton flip against the Drakes to take out one of Sandra's core allies in Rupert. To make matters worse, Sandra does not even follow her group's original plan at Tribal Council, as she votes against Fairplay for seemingly personal reasons. Sandra is later well positioned in the end with Fairplay, someone who she can easily beat in a jury vote, but it's important to remember that Sandra did not intend on rolling with him that far into the season. After the Rupert elimination, Sandra is outplayed by Fairplay just about every round, as he continues to rebuild trust with her, only to flip against her soon after. At Final 7, Sandra contributes to the Tawana vote, which is definitely a questionable move on her end, considering that Tawana seemed like a player that was more loyal to the Sandra-Krista contingency over the Fairplay Burton one. Then at Final 6, Sandra is blindsided once again, this time losing her #1 ally in Krista. In that Tribal Council, Sandra and Krista cast their votes against Lil. We never receive a full explanation from Sandra on this vote, and given the era of the show, I am under the assumption that Sandra voted against Lil because she wanted to take Lil out of the game. Sandra later beats Lil in the final Tribal Council, but she did not plan on taking Lil to the end, despite her status as the easiest beat on the board. That stretch between the final 8 and the final 6 is an absolute disaster for Sandra. I think that the low points on Sandra's Pearl Islands game are worse than those in her Heroes vs. Villains run. However, this win ranks ahead due to Sandra's work in the endgame. At the final 5, she leads the vote against Burton. That vote is potentially the best strategic move in Sandra's entire Survivor career. But we also need to acknowledge the fact that Burton wins reward that same episode, and he selects Fairplay to join him. That pair clearly presented themselves as a duo, and they left the women alone at camp to conspire against them. So it's still a positive move by Sandra, but it's also one that's facilitated by the misplay of Burton. At Final 4, Dara loses immunity, and she's taken out as the biggest jury threat in the game. Sandra reaches the Final 3 in a great spot against Lil and Fairplay. She defeats either of them in a jury vote, and Lil intends on taking Sandra to the final tribal. I would love to credit Sandra for her late game positioning, but as mentioned earlier, Sandra attempted to vote out both Lil and Fairplay in the post-merge. Had Sandra gotten her way and she rode to the end with her main allies of Krista and Rupert, her chances of winning a jury vote are not as high. Sandra then defeats Lil in a 6-1 jury vote. To be honest, I think that this margin speaks more to the jury's hatred for Lil rather than their admiration for Sandra. Multiple contestants have reported after the season that they did not really respect Sandra's game. They just hated Lil. So overall, I think that Sandra's Pearl Islands game stands as the upgraded version of her Heroes vs. Villains one. At the same time though, there are multiple rounds where Sandra has no clue what's going on as Fair Play is running the show. Plus, she has the Outcast twist which breaks in her favor. It's an up and down game that still ranks in the bottom 10. She's here at 38. On to number 37, we got a winner who I adore from a character perspective. This is one of my absolute favorite contestants from Old School Survivor, who I genuinely wanted to rank higher on the list. But it's difficult to look at her winning game as anything but ineffective and under the radar. It's Vecepia Towery, the winner of Survivor Marquesas. I think that many people look back on Vecepia's win and remember it favorably due to its historical significance. She's the first player to win the show while operating outside the majority alliance. Every winner prior to Vecepia entered the merge with the numbers advantage, they picked off every member of the opposing tribe, and they navigated through the endgame with their original group. Vecepia overcame more adversity than any other player at that point in Survivor history. All of that is very admirable. However, I think Vecepia was not very active in her navigation through the game, and by the late post-merge, she is poorly positioned within the tribe. So in the pre-merge, Vecepia finds her way into the majority of the original Maramu tribe. She works with Boston Rob and the famous Hunter blindside. At the swap, Vecepia is thrown into a pretty unfavorable spot as her group is outnumbered 5-3. While that tribe attends just one tribal council, you need to credit Vecepia in that she avoids the target better than any of her Maramu allies. Vecepia enters the merge down in numbers according to original tribal lines, but she's still perceived as the lowest level threat amidst the Maramu minority. She loses Boston Rob at Final 10, but then there's the historic Final 9 Tribal Council, which marks the first major flip in Survivor history as the collection of Kathy, Nalia, and Pascal all jump ship from their original Row 2 tribe to work with Vecepia and Sean on the bottom. It's undoubtedly an iconic moment in terms of the development of Survivor strategy, but in reviewing the season, I found that Vecepia was probably the least instrumental to that move. We see Sean and Kathy come up with the idea for the flip. From there, Kathy pitches the move to Nalia and Pascal. That flip was the most impactful vote of the entire season, yet Vecepia was merely a passenger for it. She's safe for the next couple rounds as the new majority picks off the Row 2 players on the bottom in Zoe, then Tammy, then the General. But then we hit the final 5, where once again, Vecepia loses control. Kathy is positioned in the middle, and she elects to align with the pair of Nalia and Pascal to take out Vecepia's #1 ally in Sean. As a result, Vecepia enters the Final 4 as the consensus target, and her only avenue through that round is just winning immunity, which is pretty bad. The Final 4 challenge ends up being Fallen Comrades, a challenge that Vecepia directly prepared for all season by writing down information on the other players in her journal. It's definitely a positive for Vecepia in that she wins immunity through her preparation, but I also think that Vecepia gets very lucky in terms of the timing of this challenge. With the immunity necklace around her neck, Vecepia identifies the pairing of Nalia and Pascal as a threat, and she aligns with Kathy to break up that pair. She forces a tied vote, which sends Pascal home on the rock draw. That rock draw still creates hesitation for me when looking at Vecepia's game. Yes, there was a 2/3 chance of Vecepia's side winning that draw, but in the event that Kathy goes home at Final 4, Vecepia is once again positioned at the Final 3 in a spot where she needs individual immunity. Then in the final immunity challenge, Kathy drops out, and Vecepia pivots to a Final 2 deal with Nalia. I'm conflicted on this decision by Vecepia as it proved that she could recognize that she had a better chance at beating Nalia in a jury vote over Kathy. At the same time though, by making her flip a public affair, Vecepia actively burns Kathy's jury vote. That jury vote is absolutely essential for Vecepia because she did not have a lot of win equity. Yes, she barely beats Nalia in a 4-3 jury vote, but she likely loses most other Final Tribal Council combinations against the likes of Kathy, Pascal, or Sean. Even in her ideal endgame scenario against Nalia, Vecepia flops in her Final Tribal Council speech. According to John Carroll, the Final Tribal Council performances on Marquesas were so bad that production made the cast refilm the entire event. So I look at Vecepia's game as one where she constantly benefits from the strategic reads of others, especially at the Final 9. While she finishes the season strong with her maneuvers at the Final 4 and Final 3, I don't think that those 2 rounds are enough to pull Vecepia out of this lower tier. She ranks here at 37. At 36, we got another winner that lands in this ineffective under-the-radar tier. This is a player who probably held more agency than the other winners in this group. I also think that this contestant was better at identifying his optimal strategic move, but he often failed to pull the votes together for his various schemes. It's Adam Klein, the winner of Survivor Millennials versus Gen X. Like Vecepia and Sandra below him, Adam's win is a very mixed bag. I actually had a difficult time determining the best tier for Adam. On the surface, he's not actively positioning himself under the radar. Rather, Adam finds himself in that spot through the strategic dominance of David and to a lesser extent Hannah. Out of the gate, Adam is left out of the Mari vote at the first Millennial Tribal Council. He rebounds after that vote though, and he finds his way into the new Millennial majority. At the tribe swap, Adam is positioned as the swing vote with Ken and Jessica on one side and Taylor and Figgy on the other. I think that Adam makes the correct move there in aligning with the Gen Xers to take out Figgy. That move locks down Adam's alliance with Ken and Jessica, both of whom remain loyal to him through the rest of the season. At the merge, Adam's game gets a bit sloppy as he attempts to target Will, and he shares this plan with one of Will's closest allies in Taylor. As a result, the minority votes against Adam at the final 13, where Michelle goes home. After that, Adam gets caught up in the food smuggling situation with Taylor. Moving ahead to the final 10, Adam gets unlucky as his side loses the Rock Draw Tribal Council. I think you can fault Adam for putting himself in a spot where there was a 1 out of 8 chance of him going home, but even after that setback, Adam's group regains control at final 9, where Will Wall flips over to their side to take out Zeke. When I'm honest, I don't see that Tribal Council as a real testament to Adam's game. In my mind, that was an instance of Will making a hyper-aggressive decision independent of Adam's influence. Then at final 8, Adam is the player that leads the charge against Will. It's probably his most tangible strategic move of the entire season. After the Will boot, Adam's main alliance of himself, Hannah, David, and Ken come together to run the endgame. Through that stretch, though, I don't think that Adam holds much agency. At final 7, we see Hannah direct the vote onto Sunday. Then at final 6, it's David who takes the lead in tricking Jay with a fake idol. Final 5 is another low point for Adam where he's straight up left out of the plan to take out Brett. Now, I think Adam has the correct read there to target David over Brett, but it's still a negative in that Adam cannot convince his allies to follow through with that idea. This leaves Adam at the final 4 with a clear losing scenario. If David wins final immunity, Adam likely goes out in 4th place, and even if David elects to take him to the final tribal, he crushes Adam in a jury vote. At the end of the day, Adam reaches the final tribal council against Hannah and Ken, where he wins in a unanimous jury vote. But I feel that many of those pro-Adam votes derive from the misconceptions of the jury. For example, Chris credits Adam for convincing Ken to take out David at final 4, when in reality, Adam was the least instrumental player to that move. So all in all, while Adam held more agency than other players in this tier, I still consider him an ineffective strategic player on the season. There are multiple rounds where Adam is either sitting in the passenger seat or completely oblivious to what's going on. I'll rank him here at number 36. At 35, I have the second winner from the new era to appear on this list. Out of these 7 new era winners, I had the most difficulty determining the best tier for this player. I think there's an argument for describing him as either safely under the radar or ineffective under the radar. But anyways, here at 35, I got Mike Gabler, the winner of Survivor 43. I think that Gabler was a player who did not hold much control throughout the season, but he was always positioned well to the point where his name was not written down in a single tribal council. In other words, Gabler maintained a wide web of alliances, but those connections never materialized in strategic agency. The difficult aspect to assess with Gabler's game is the reasoning behind his social insulation. I think that many people wanted to connect with Gabler because he was perceived as an easy beat, and I don't necessarily know if they were wrong. Yes, Gabler wins the season against Owen and Cassidy, but I think he loses most other Final Tribal Council scenarios. So with Gabler, you have this contestant who's coasting round to round through his mediocre reputation, but by the end, he finds himself sitting against two lower-level threats. So jumping right in, Gabler's low points come at the beginning of the season, where he's positioned towards the bottom of the Baka tribe. He eventually recovers from this spot as he aligns with the Baka boys in Owen and Sammy, and at the Mergatory, Gabler takes the reins for the first and only time all season as he directs the vote onto Ellie. I think a major factor that distinguishes Gabler from Owen and Cassidy in the final tribal is this tangible move on his resume. After the Ellie vote, Gabler is excluded from the Dwight blind side, but starting at the final 11, he takes on this Alec Gabler persona as he submerges underwater and plays the rest of the season under the radar. He connects with the pairing of Cody and Jesse, and he follows their various plans for the next 5 rounds. The final 7 is an important round in Gabler's game in that we clearly hear him identify Cassidy and Owen as his best final tribal scenario. Gabler knows the final destination, but he's not very active in carving his path to that point, where at the final 6, Jesse takes the lead in the Cody vote. Then at Final 5, Carla is the consensus boot as the biggest threat on the board. By the time Gabler reaches the Final 4, the only remaining obstacle in his way is Jesse, who had already painted a massive target on himself through his strategic dominance in the previous 2 rounds. Gabler plays that last round perfectly as he volunteers for firemaking and defeats Jesse. I personally don't value a firemaking win that much in these rankings, but the jury of 43 placed a lot of emphasis on that move. I know that Gabler's endgame looks impressive on paper as the 3 big threats of Cody, Carla, and Jesse are all taken out, but to me, that stretch in 43 feels more like the big threats cannibalizing each other rather than Gabler taking control of the game. He ends up winning in a 7-1-0 jury vote, meaning that he was literally 1 jury vote away from having a perfect game. So I look at Gabler as the prototypical under-the-radar winner of the new era. I think you can move him up or down this list depending on the degree of control you think he held in the post-merge. I'm under the impression that Gabler was pretty passive in his various alliances. I'll put him here at number 35. On to number 34, we can start the third tier of the list that I'm calling clean under the radar. Like the previous tier, these players did not have much control in navigating through the season. Unlike the winners we already discussed, there are rarely any rounds where the players in this tier completely lose control. Further, there are few rounds where these winners are actively targeted. So here at 34, we have a contestant who is known for working behind an icon of the franchise. It's Amber Brkich, the winner of Survivor All-Stars. My ranking for Amber hinges on my belief that she did not hold much agency in working alongside her number 1 ally and now husband, Boston Rob Mariano. If you believe that Rob and Amber held almost equal agency, then you should definitely rank her higher. In my opinion, though, Rob was the one calling the shots, and Amber was along for the ride. Most of the alliances that carry Rob and Amber through the game are those established by Rob. While Rob takes the strategic lead in that partnership, you still need to credit Amber for her relationship with him. Rob was dead set on rolling to the final tribal council with Amber. Amber reciprocates these feelings partially because she's in love with Rob, but also because she thinks that he will burn jury votes en route to the end. Amber is 100% correct in this read, but she's pretty ineffective in strategically guiding the season to that point. From the beginning, Amber is in the majority on the Shapira tribe, where she's aligned with Rob. At the first swap, we see Rob and Amber connect with Rupert and Jenna, but I feel that Rob was more instrumental in the creation of that alliance. Then we get to the second swap of the season, where Amber is sent to the opposing Mogo Mogo tribe by herself. It looks like Amber is dead to rights, but she survives due to Rob's pregame alliance with Lex and Kathy. To be honest, I don't fault Amber too much for this round, as the swap itself was incredibly unlucky for her. At the same time, though, it's a clear example of Amber relying on Rob's connections to guide her through the season. Once Amber reaches the merge, her alliance comes back together to knock out all of the Mogo Mogo players in Lex, Kathy, and Cheyenne. During that stretch, Amber allows Rob to play out in front and take the blame for their cutthroat strategic moves. This is especially apparent at the Lex vote, where there's that infamous argument between Rob and Lex at camp, and Amber isn't even on screen. I'd also note that throughout the post-merge, Rob and Amber are perfectly positioned within their main alliance, with Alicia and Tom on one side and Rupert and Jenna on the other. When the numbers dwindle, Rob takes the lead, enrolling with Jenna and Rupert to the Final Four. At the Final Four, Amber wins a key immunity challenge, which enables them to strong-arm Jenna into flipping against Rupert. By the time Amber reaches the Final Three, she is in a position where she wins the game as long as Jenna does not win final immunity, as Jenna was planning on voting her out over Rob. Rob ends up winning final immunity, and he takes Amber to the final tribal, which showcases her strong position alongside the season's best strategic player. In the end, Amber defeats Rob in a 4-3 jury vote, but when I'm honest, I feel that most of Amber's jury votes were more so anti-Rob than pro-Amber. We know for a fact that the trio of Lex, Big Tom, and Alicia would not vote for Rob in any final tribal council combination. Amber also picks up the jury vote of Cheyenne through a misconception, as Cheyenne mistakenly believes that Amber was the dominant strategic figure between her and Rob. So I still don't think too highly of Amber's win on All-Stars. It's a win that's highly dependent on the social misplay of Rob rather than the individual excellence of Amber. Yes, Amber was correct in her assessment of Rob, but I think that banking on your competitor's downfalls is a more passive way of playing the game. It earns Amber the number 34 spot. At number 33, I have a winner who I view as similar to Amber in that both of them operated behind a strategically dominant figure for the entire season. It's Natalie White, the winner of Survivor Samoa. The first thing that comes to mind for me when I think of Natalie is her awareness within the game. At an early point in Samoa, Natalie identifies Russell Hantz as a strategically dominant figure who would burn bridges en route to the final tribal council. With that information, she attaches herself to the hip of Russell and enables him to carve their path. While you can definitely criticize Natalie for her lack of agency through the game, I think she does an incredible job in gaining the trust of Russell. Russell considers flipping against every core member of his alliance, with the exception of Natalie. I've said this on the page before, but Natalie's game in Samoa is what people think Sandra did in Heroes vs. Villains, where Sandra constantly attempts and fails to take out Russell on that season. Natalie had the correct read from the very beginning. Through that alliance with Russell, Natalie has a path to the end with a few bumps along the way. In the early days of the Foa Foa tribe, Natalie connects with Russell as a member of his self-described Dumb Girls Alliance. From the beginning, Russell perceives Natalie as a complete non-threat that he intends on dragging to the end. Through the pre-merge, Natalie follows Russell's lead, and she's in the majority at every tribal council. Her alliance with Russell comes at a price, though, and at the final 15, she votes out her second closest ally in Ashley. Natalie's Foa Foa tribe enters the merge of Samoa down in numbers 8-4, and at the final 12, Natalie plays an active role in convincing the Galoo majority to flip against each other in taking out Eric. Like Gabler, Natalie makes a solid move in the early merge, then she fades into the background for the rest of the season as she relies on the strategic reads of Russell. The final 11 is a round that drastically benefits Natalie's game through circumstances outside her control. At that point, the Galoo majority comes back together to target Russell, who negates their votes using an idol. In that tribal, Natalie gets very lucky in that first, Russell finds an idol at all, and second, that Galoo elected to not split the vote. Had Russell gone out in that spot, Natalie's side is outnumbered 7-3, and she's likely voted out in the next couple rounds. Then at final 10, Russell convinces Shambo and John to flip over to the Foa Foa alliance, which enables that group to dominate the rest of the post-merge. They pick off former Galoo members between the final 9 and final 7. Even though Russell is the player coordinating the vote in those rounds, Natalie is the one connecting with her competition and creating advocates for the jury. That jury potential is a major positive within Natalie's game, as I think she beats all of her core allies in a jury vote. We later see her beat Russell and Mick in the end, and she more than likely defeats Shambo and Jason as well. The only player who had a real shot at beating Natalie in a jury vote was Brett, who, to be fair, came one immunity challenge away from winning the season. I think you can fault Natalie in that she needed Russell to beat Brett in that last challenge. At the same time, though, even if Brett won final immunity, I think he takes Natalie to the end, so her path to the final tribal was guaranteed either way, but the win itself was not. So I can understand the argument for Natalie ranking lower on the list due to her lack of agency, but I think her positioning as well as her win equity are enough to boost her up to the number 33 spot. On to the number 32 spot, we will start up my fourth tier in the ranking that I'm calling Section Dominance. This is a group of players who ran the game for part of the season, but they either lost control at some point or faded into the background. So here at 32, I have a winner who I considered ranking higher on the list. Like the other winners in this tier, this player lost control for part of the game, but I feel that loss of agency was more so due to pre-merge challenge results rather than a glaring strategic mistake on her end. It's Danni Boatwright, the winner of Survivor Guatemala. Evaluating Danni's game is a bit difficult as she's not very prominent in the season's edit. Danni herself admits that she was not completely transparent during confessionals because she was worried that production would leak her information to other players. Everything up until the merge of Guatemala is great for Danni. She really runs the season through those first 7 episodes. In her swap tribe, Danni aligns with Brandon, and the two of them work at the center of the majority alliance, directing the target onto the likes of Blake, Brian, and Amy. Now, it's impressive that Danni acquired power in the game, but I don't know if she made the right decisions with that agency. The Blake and Brian votes in particular stand out as questionable moves. Danni's tribe is later decimated in the post-merge because they were down in numbers 6-4. Had Danni kept some of those physical players around, then maybe the split is not so lopsided. Then we get to the merge where everything kind of falls apart for Danni. Her entire tribe is knocked out by the opposing Nakum alliance. By the final 6, Danni has no remaining pre-merge allies. Now, Danni deserves respect for her threat level management in that part of the game, as she was the last one standing despite her history of dominating the pre-merge. At the same time though, it's a long section of the season where Danni is completely out of the loop. It's not until the final 6 that Danni recovers as she connects with Rafe, the head strategist of the majority. That alliance with Rafe pays major dividends as he pulls Danni further into the season. Rafe knows that Danni has 3 locked jury votes in Brandon, Bobby John, and Gary, who were all aligned with her in the pre-merge. At the end of the day though, he's blinded by their friendship and he takes Danni to the final 3 over players like Lydia, who he could easily defeat in the final immunity challenge. It's really impressive that Danni was able to recover and sneak her way into the dominant power structure, but she never holds any legitimate agency within that alliance. It's still Rafe calling the shots with Danni hiding in the background. Then we get to the final 3 where Danni is positioned as the obvious target. If either Stephanie or Rafe win final immunity, Danni gets voted out, which is pretty bad. To be fair, Danni is the consensus target because she is so well liked by the jury. I think Danni beats both Stephanie and Rafe in a jury vote by a solid margin. So with Danni, we're looking at a player with poor late game positioning, but also high win equity. She ends up winning that final immunity challenge, takes Stephanie to the final tribal, and wins in a 6-1 jury vote. So I feel that Danni's win on Guatemala does a lot more for my assessment of her as a Survivor player, as she proves on this season that she can operate from both the top and the bottom. As it pertains to my winner ranking, this game is nowhere close to a dominant performance. For around half the season, Danni is either outside the majority or relying on Rafe to carry her round to round. The fact that her alliance with Rafe had an expiration date also draws major concerns for me. It's Danni's dominance in the pre-merge of Guatemala that elevates her in my ranking. I'll put her here at number 32. On to number 31, we can talk about one of my favorite winners in the history of the show. It's Denise Stapley, the winner of Survivor Philippines. Denise is known for being the only winner that survives every possible tribal council, which speaks volumes to her social game. Now, Denise isn't skating through these tribals easily. There are multiple rounds throughout the season where she becomes a legitimate target, but the fact that she survived every tribal is still very impressive. I put Denise in this section dominance tier because she controls her initial tribe in the early game, but she's in and out of the majority throughout the post-merge. Denise starts Survivor Philippines on the Matsing tribe, which is widely regarded as one of the worst tribes in the history of the show. Matsing loses every immunity challenge in the pre-merge. As her group is slowly decimated, Denise positions herself at its core alongside Malcolm and Russell Swan. When that tribe cuts down to just that trio, Denise is positioned in the middle, and she elects to vote out Russell. That move solidifies her alliance with Malcolm through the rest of the post-merge. When the Matsing tribe dissolves and Denise swaps over to the Kalabao tribe, she's completely outnumbered 6-1, but she flies under the radar. She aligns with the men of the tribe and survives 2 eliminations. I feel like the pre-merge of this season really proved that Denise could excel from a position of power or from the bottom. It's honestly one of the best pre-merge games of any winner on this list. The post-merge of Philippines is a different story. There are multiple rounds where Denise just doesn't really know what's going on, and when she's in the loop, it's mainly through her connection with Malcolm. Early on, Denise is on the wrong side of the RC vote and the Jeff Kent vote. At Final 8, we see Denise's Final 4 alliance come together, but it's not due to the active work of Denise herself. Malcolm is the player who aligns with Scoopin and Lisa, forming a Final 4 deal as he connected with them in the swap section of the game. It's great that Denise was roped into that plan, but it's a clear example of her relying on the strategic work of Malcolm. That new alliance steamrolls the game from the Final 7 through the Final 5, and in that stretch, Denise forfeits many of her pre-merge allies. Then at Final 4, we have one of the biggest issues that I take with Denise's win, in that her outlook on the final tribal was pretty bad. She originally intended on going to the end with Malcolm in a spot where Malcolm likely beats her. Denise only flips on Malcolm because he's hesitant to accept a Final 3 deal. In my mind, Denise relies on the poor play of Malcolm to wake her up and help her identify her ideal Final Tribal Council scenario. Other winners on this list had the correct read from the very beginning. Denise then defeats Scoopin and Lisa in a 6-1-1 jury vote, and I think Denise's win equity was another standout aspect of her game. Outside of Malcolm, I think Denise beats most other players in a jury vote. So like I said earlier, Denise has one of the best pre-merge games of any winner, but I think she's overly dependent on Malcolm in the second half. Combine that with the fact that her outlook on the final tribal was just wrong, and you get the 31st best winning game of Survivor. At number 30, we have the third new era contestant to appear on this list. It's Maryanne Oketch, the winner of Survivor 42. The factor that distinguishes Maryanne from other winners in this tier is her degree of dominance in the endgame. Maryanne has some tangible strategic moves on her resume, which is not really the case for some of the players below her. With that said, I think that Maryanne is worse than those winners in terms of her social insulation. There are multiple points on 42 where Maryanne is in serious danger of going home, and she either lucks out with tribal challenge wins or relies on her allies to straight up save her. In the pre-merge, Maryanne is on the outside of the Taku 4 alliance. For 3 straight episodes, Maryanne is on the bottom of her tribe, and if they lost immunity at any point, she's probably voted out. To be fair though, Maryanne was pretty unlucky in that Jackson was pulled from the game in the premiere. Had Jackson stuck around, Maryanne is still positioned towards the bottom of that group, but there's at least a buffer in place to go home before her. Maryanne's poor positioning continues into the early merge, where she's targeted at the final 12 and relies on Omer to step in and shift the vote onto Lydia. The split tribal is another rough look for Maryanne, as her name is in serious circulation, but she's able to survive that round through an idol play. I don't really know how to assess that tribal from Maryanne's perspective, as she plays the idol due to the entire Roxroy situation, so it's not completely clear if she picked up on the fact that she was a potential target. Starting at the final 8, Maryanne works back into the majority, reconnecting with the Takus and taking out the likes of Hai and Drea. It's not until the final 6 that Maryanne really grabs the game by the horns. That stretch between the final 6 and the final tribal is some of the best strategic maneuvering seen by any winner discussed thus far on the list. At Final 6, she orchestrates the Omer blindside, a move that required Maryanne's extra vote, which ensured that she received all of the credit. Then at Final 5, Maryanne deceives Mike into playing an idol on her, which is great from the perspective of threat level management. At that point in the season, Maryanne was the second biggest jury threat in the game, only behind Lindsay, yet Mike still gives Maryanne a free pass to the Final 4. That move also enables Maryanne to pull off this flashy moment at Final Tribal where she shows her immunity idol. Maryanne's navigation through the Final 4 is even better. There, Maryanne was one of the biggest remaining jury threats, yet she's able to convince Romeo to take her to the Final Tribal. Now, according to postseason interviews, Jonathan and Mike both intended on throwing Maryanne into fire-making, but it's still impressive that she maintained an ally in Romeo who stuck by her side until the end. When Maryanne walks into the Final Tribal against Mike and Romeo, she did not initially have the win on lock. She needed to pull jury votes away from Mike, and she succeeds by taking credit for the Omer blindside and revealing her idol. So Maryanne's game is an interesting body of work with more dramatic high points and low points than other winners in this tier. In my opinion, Maryanne's dominance through those last couple rounds make up for her early mistakes. I'll place her here at number 30. We can follow up Maryanne at 30 with a similar winner who earned the title of Sole Survivor just 2 years later. It's Kenzie Petty, the winner of Survivor 46. We covered this season live on the Survivor Analytics podcast, and at the time of the season finale, I was not very high on Kenzie. Over time, my opinion of her game gradually improved. I think that Kenzie is a winner that did not hold much agency throughout the season. There isn't really a staple strategic move on her resume. In fact, Kenzie's intended big move of blindsiding her number one ally, Tiffany, happens without any influence from Kenzie herself. She kind of coasts through most of the game. She relies on her social bonds, avoids the target, and eventually cashes in on her respective jury votes. It's not a flashy win by any means, but it's a pretty clean route to the Final Tribal. I put Kenzie in this section dominance tier for her gameplay in the pre-merge, where she runs the Yanu tribe alongside Tiffany. That pair serves as the head decision makers in knocking out the likes of Jelinski, Jess, and Banu. While Kenzie's pre-merge game is exceptional, I think it's important to acknowledge the impact of the Randon medical evacuation. In episode 3, Yanu lost the immunity challenge, and they were preparing to attend Tribal Council where the two big names on the board were Banu and Kenzie. The Randon medevac cancels that tribal, which greatly benefits Kenzie's game. Now, I'm not saying that Kenzie would have been voted out there. I think it's far more likely that it's a unanimous vote against Banu. The real issue that I see is Kenzie's positioning after a Banu elimination. In that scenario, Tiffany is positioned in the middle between Kenzie and Q. Yanu loses the immunity challenge in episode 4, meaning without the Randon medevac, Kenzie attends a 3-person tribal council where she's in serious danger. Meanwhile, Kenzie's post-merge game is pretty uneventful, which is obviously a negative in that she never takes control, but it's also a positive in that Kenzie avoided the target for that entire stretch while maintaining substantial win equity. Kenzie has her name written down just one time in the post-merge, and that was a throwaway vote from Ben at the Final 7. In the early merge, she heavily depends on the strategic work of Tiffany and Q. At Final 8, she's blindsided by the Tiffany boot. Then at Final 7, she fails to gather the numbers against Q. Kenzie finds her way back into the majority at Final 6, but I think that was a point in the season where the targets of Q and Maria were so large that it didn't feel like the creation of a new alliance. That collection of Charlie, Liz, Ben, and Kenzie simply came together to knock out those contestants with the highest win equity. Then at Final 4, Kenzie is thrown into fire-making by her ally Ben, which is another rough look for her. Kenzie has this reputation as a savvy social player, yet she's unable to use those relationships to advance herself in the game. Ben putting Kenzie into fire-making actually facilitates her win, as Maria later casts her jury vote for Kenzie because she saw the fire in her eyes. And that takes us to the Final Tribal Council, where Kenzie narrowly squeaks out the win. She defeats Charlie and Ben in a 5-3-0 jury vote, but Ben has reported postseason that if the Final Tribal ended in a 4-4 tie, he would have cast the winning vote of the season for Charlie. So you can definitely question Kenzie's strategic impact on season 46, but I don't consider her a complete coattail rider. Really, it's Kenzie's social insulation and win equity that separate her from the other players in this tier. I'll place her here at number 29. On to number 28, I got another member of this section dominance tier. It's Nick Wilson, the winner of Survivor David vs. Goliath. With Nick, this is a winner with a wide range of outcomes throughout the season. Nick's highlights in Season 37 are some of the most impressive strategic moves seen through that point in Survivor history. Nick's lowlights are pretty disastrous. Not to the extent that he was saved by production interference like the players in my bottom tier, but still enough to hold him back in the ranking. From the get-go, Nick is on the outside of the Davids tribe, and it's been reported after the season that his name was in serious circulation for that first Davids tribal council. Without the Pat medical evacuation in the premiere, Nick is potentially the first boot, which is not a great look. After that rough start, Nick immediately recovers and forms new connections with the likes of Christian and Davey. He actually operates as the swing vote alongside Christian for the first Davids Tribal Council, where they take out Jess. He continues to work within the majority until the swap, where he's thrown into an unfavorable position where his side is outnumbered 3-2. There again, Nick adapts and he aligns with the pairing of Mike and Angelina. He survives 2 tribal councils in that section of the season. Entering the merge, Nick's original Davids tribe is at a numbers disadvantage. After losing Elizabeth at Final 13, Nick steps up and pushes the game in another direction with one of the most impressive strategic moves from that era of the show, the John Hennigan blindside. In that round, Nick is the key player acquiring intel from the Goliaths Alliance. He learns that Christian is the target of that group, and he brings that information to Davey, who holds an idol. So his work as the messenger there is great, but he takes this plan a step further by orchestrating a minority vote split that ultimately sends John out of the game. It's probably the best strategic play by any winner discussed through this point on the list. In the following round, Nick's side takes another swing at the Goliaths Alliance, this time voting Dan out of the game through Nick's vote steal and Carl's idol nullifier. Nick's game on paper is phenomenal through the final 9, but at that point it kinda unravels. Between the final 9 and the final 6, Nick is either completely left out of the vote or enacting plans that are detrimental to his long-term winning potential. He's excluded from the Carl blindside at final 9. At final 8, Nick fails to take out Christian, who successfully plays an idol, sending Gabby home. Then at final 7, Nick accomplishes his goal of voting out Christian, but he also misplays an idol on himself at Tribal Council. It's worth mentioning that the Christian blindside was pretty bad for Nick's game. That move gives the Goliaths a comfortable 4-2 numbers advantage at the final 6. From that spot, Nick wins every remaining immunity challenge, but it's not clear if Nick absolutely needed those immunity necklaces. Players like Mike White have stated after the show that they were determined to go to the end with Nick, but I think there's a real chance that Nick goes home at 6 if Davey wins immunity. Regardless, Nick is blindsided by the Davey vote at final 6, but he recovers once again by realigning with Mike and Angelina, who run the game and go to the final tribal council together. Nick wins David versus Goliath in a 7-3-0 jury vote, and I think Nick wins most final tribal council combinations. He had the storyline of the season, the underdog that overcame the Goliath Alliance. So as I said earlier, Nick has some very impressive rounds on this season, namely the John vote at final 12 and the Dan vote at final 11. His work through the late merge is definitely subject to criticism, and with Nick, I think it's worth saying that I personally do not value all strategic dominance equally. I think it's generally more impressive to run the late game as opposed to the pre-merge. That philosophy works against Nick, and it leads me to rank him here at number 28. At number 27, I got a winner whose game I see as an improved version of the Danni Boatwright win. Both of them dominated the pre-merge, then fell to the bottom in the early merge as they lost all of their original tribal alliances. What distinguishes this winner from Danni is his work in the endgame. Where Danni functions on the bottom through the finale, this winner regains control for those last couple rounds. It's Chris Doherty, the winner of Survivor Vanuatu. So like I said, Chris's storyline on Vanuatu mirrors that of Danni on Guatemala, where from the jump, Chris is in the majority of the Fat Five alliance that runs the Lepevi tribe in the pre-merge. He has some hiccups in the premiere as he's the target of the minority alliance, but after the first episode, it's straight up dominance for Chris. At the swap, Chris operates the middle, this time between the men and women. That group attends just one tribal council, where Chris makes the crucial mistake of voting out John Kenny, which gives the women the numbers advantage at the merge. Now, from Chris's perspective, John Kenny was an unreliable ally that would flip against the men in the early merge, but I think John would have remained loyal for at least that first vote. Due to that decision to knock out John, Chris enters the merge down in number 6-4, and he proceeds to lose all of his allies in Rory, followed by Sarge, followed by Chad. During that stretch, Chris has no real strategic agency, but he's building bonds with the members of the majority, players like Julie, Eliza, Scout, and Twyla. Those relationships pay off at the final 7, where the women elect to flip on each other over voting out Chris from the bottom. I feel that the legacy of Chris Daugherty stands on this idea of him outplaying the women, but he's not really the contestant that breaks up their alliance. In reality, it's Scout and Twyla taking the lead, cannibalizing their own. They pull Chris into the mix, and Chris is responsible for drawing Eliza onto their side. While it's great that Chris was able to help establish this new 4-person majority, it's important to remember that Eliza was not even essential to that final 7 tribal council given the distribution of the votes. It's not until the final 6 that Chris grabs control of the game again, as his new majority alliance eliminates the outsiders in Amy and Julie. By the time Chris reaches the final 4, he's the best positioned player in the game, as he's got both Eliza and Twyla working to take him to the final tribal council. Chris makes the right strategic decision of voting out Eliza at final 4, which puts him at the final 3 in a spot where the only way he does not make it to the end is if Scout, the oldest player on the entire cast, wins final immunity. I think it's really impressive that Chris was able to solidify a final 2 deal with Twyla, considering that Twyla had worked alongside Scout for the entire season. Chris then wins final immunity, takes Twyla to the end, and wins the season by a pretty comfortable margin. Chris's final tribal council is widely regarded as one of the best performances in the history of the show, as he reconnects with the jury and tells them exactly what they want to hear. You can compare Chris's final tribal council speech to Twyla's, who actively burned multiple jury votes. Chris's composure in front of the jury does a lot more for my assessment of him as a player than a Survivor winner. So I think Chris perfectly fits the description of this section dominance tier. He has a complete strategic stranglehold in both the pre-merge and the endgame, but that rocky stretch between the final 10 and final 7 still matters. It's a part of the game where Chris is completely helpless as he loses all of his main allies. It's enough to drop him in the ranking to the number 27 spot. At 26, we have a winner whose ranking has fluctuated a lot through my different iterations of the list. I generally don't factor quality of competition into these rankings, as it's a factor completely outside the winner's control, but this winner is a bit of an exception. It's Richard Hatch, the winner of Survivor Borneo. Analyzing Richard's game is really difficult because this was the first season of the show. Players were still building a foundational understanding of the game. You had multiple contestants on the Borneo cast who looked at Survivor through this ethical lens, one that perceived the formation of alliances as amoral. All of this is to say that Richard competed against the worst strategic cast in Survivor history. At the same time, he still finds a way to develop Survivor strategy and dominate a section of the game. Many people credit Richard as the founder of the first Survivor alliance, but that's not actually true. Sue and Kelly established that alliance, and they pull Richard, followed by Rudy, into the mix. Now, within that group, Richard is well positioned as he locks down Rudy as his number 1. From there, that group of 4 dominates the pre-merge, knocking out Stacy and Dirk. In the post-merge, the Tagi 4 runs the game, picking off all of the members of the original Pagong tribe. On the surface, it might look like Richard is leading the way, but in reality, that Tagi alliance is simply attaching their votes onto Sean, who is operating according to the alphabet strategy. The Pagong players' names were earlier in the alphabet, which enabled the Tagis to take out that entire tribe. While Richard is in the majority for that mid-merge section of the game, he's not perfect in that position. The Pagong players almost rallied the numbers against him at the final 8, and they are unsuccessful due to Sean's alphabet strategy. When Richard reaches the final 4, he does not have a clear path to the end. There's initially a tied vote between Richard and Sue in that tribal council, and Sue ultimately goes home over Richard, not due to the active work of Richard himself. Earlier in the day, Sue and Kelly had an argument, which causes Kelly to flip against Sue on the revote. So Richard surviving that round feels somewhat outside his own control. Then at Final 3, Richard makes the most impressive strategic move in his entire Survivor career in throwing the final immunity challenge to ensure that he does not need to vote out Rudy. At the same time, Richard's decision is based out of his relatively lower win equity. If Richard faces Rudy in the final tribal council, he loses the season by a pretty wide margin. Even against Kelly, who was largely disrespected by the jury, Richard wins by a single jury vote. I feel that Richard did not have many winning combinations on the board. So like I said at the beginning, it's tough ranking Richard's win because it was the first season. Richard was in the majority alliance for most of Borneo, and I think that his low points are not as damning as the other winners in this section dominance tier. Still, I don't look at Richard as this dominant strategic figure. His missteps in the endgame, especially the final 4, also factored into my ranking. I'll put him here at number 26. On to number 25, we can start the 5th tier on my list that I'm calling second in command. This next tier includes contestants who operated at the center of the majority alliance for most of the season, but they were not the head decision makers of their respective groups. They still maintained a degree of agency, which separates them from the under the radar tier. These contestants needed to overcome a strategically dominant figure either by voting them out or playing a better social game. So starting at 25, I have a winner who worked behind one of the greatest strategic minds of Survivor. It's Aras, the winner of Survivor Panama. Aras's Panama game is a great one on paper as he's always within the majority alliance, voting correctly in just about every possible tribal council. In my initial draft for this list, Aras was a couple spots higher, but a deeper look at his game revealed some cracks. I think that Aras, more so than any other winner in this second in command tier, relies on the strategic reads of his number 1 ally. I look at Cirie as the real strategic mastermind of that operation who pulled Aras through the game because he was a physical threat that could potentially defeat Terry in an immunity challenge. I also found that Aras stumbles his way through multiple sections of the season with some pretty poor play. For example, in his first tribal council on the Kasaya tribe, he tells Melinda that she's the target of the upcoming vote, which causes him to lose favor with some of the other players. Then at the second Kasaya tribal, he straight up left out of the Bob Dog vote. Going into the merge, Aras was a central member of the majority Kasaya 6, but there were players in that alliance that did not intend on working with him for the long run. People like Shane and Courtney clearly wanted to cut Aras once the numbers dwindled. Through the early merge, Aras is in a solid spot as they pick off just about every member of the opposing Lacina tribe. The only Lacina member who survives those first 3 rounds is Terry, who won individual immunity every time. On the surface, Terry appeared as this threat to Aras's game as the two of them butt heads all season. In my opinion, though, Terry actually helps Aras in that other players were incentivized to keep Aras around as the next best challenge competitor. If Terry was voted out at the final 7 as the Kasaya tribe intended, then Aras likely comes forward as a target much earlier in the season. The final 6 of Panama is the point where Aras passes the reins to Cirie and allows her to carve their path to the end. She orchestrates the Courtney blindside in a 3-2-1 vote split, followed by the Shane boot at final 5. And while Aras is alongside Cirie for those moves, she's the one really running the show. At the same time, I need to credit Aras for his jury management in that stretch. Despite Cirie calling the shots in their alliance, the other contestants perceived Aras as the figurehead. I really think that had Cirie sat next to Aras in the final tribal, Aras probably beats her due to that misconception. Aras had the jury stock to defeat most of this cast in the end. At Final 4, Aras wins a crucial immunity challenge, but they're still unable to vote out Terry because Terry holds an immunity idol. Instead, you have the fire-making challenge between Danielle and Cirie, where Cirie goes out and Aras loses his number 1 ally in the game. When Aras reaches the final 3, he is in a spot where he wins the season as long as Terry does not win final immunity. Danielle, out of all people, wins that last challenge and elects to take Aras to the end. You could credit Aras for his late-game positioning, but I see this more as Terry mismanaging his threat level. Aras then defeats Danielle in a 5-2 jury vote, making him the 12th winner of Survivor. So I feel that Aras played a semi-dominant game, but it is still one where he relied on the strategic reads of a Survivor legend. That factor, along with his dependence on Terry, lands Aras here at number 25. At number 24, we have the second winner in this second in command tier in Sophie Clarke, with her run on Season 23 Survivor South Pacific. On the surface, I feel that Sophie's game is really defined by her outlook on Coach. Sophie correctly identifies Coach as a player who was first, completely loyal, and second, unwilling to own up to his deceptive gameplay. For those reasons, Coach was the best person to take to the final tribal council, and Sophie allows him to carve their path. Now, I understand that Sophie and Albert both claim postseason that they used Coach as a figurehead of their alliance, but I disagree. I think that there are rounds of the game where Coach is clearly the one doing the legwork for that group. With that said, Sophie is still in a great position all season. She's safely within the majority alliance, and she votes correctly in almost every tribal council. From the beginning, she's in the majority on the Apolu tribe, aligning with Coach and Albert. In their third tribal council, Sophie attempts to pivot away from that alliance to save Michaela, and she straight up fails in this plan. It's one of those examples that point to Coach as the dominant strategic figure of the season as he works alongside Brandon to take out Michaela against Sophie's wishes. The merge is another example of Sophie relying on Coach. With 12 players remaining, it was an even 6-6 split between the Apolu Alliance and the Savai'i Alliance. Coach is the person that convinces Cochrane to flip over to their side. It's unquestionably the most important vote of the season. It gives Sophie's side the numbers advantage, and they run the table from there. Without that move from Coach, this season would look completely different. From the final 11 onwards, Sophie's alliance dominates the game. They pick off all of the original Savai'i members between the final 11 and the final 8. At final 7, you have Sophie's best move of the season. In that round, Coach had the opportunity to pivot to an alliance with Cochrane and Edna, who were both hated by the jury. At the end of the day, though, his connection to Sophie and Albert means more to him, and he remains loyal to that group against his best interest. The late post-merge is a bit rocky for Sophie, as she's the target of the minority alliance at the Brandon vote and the Rick Blind side. Regardless, Sophie still gets her way in both of those tribal councils. Then at Final 4, Sophie wins the most important immunity challenge of the season, defeating Ozzy, who is widely regarded as the best challenge competitor in the history of the show. Without that challenge win, Ozzy reaches the end and crushes a jury vote. Instead, Sophie navigates to her ideal Final 3 against Coach and Albert, where she wins in a 6-3-0 jury vote. It's important to remember that there were members of the jury who walked into the final tribal prepared to vote in favor of Coach in the event that he owned up to his deceptive gameplay. Coach completely flops in the final tribal, and those jury votes shift to Sophie. I think you can take issue with the fact that Sophie's win is a bit more dependent on the downfall of other players rather than her individual excellence. I gave Sophie a lot of credit earlier for her ability to recognize her winning scenarios, but I'd also throw out that there were not many winning combinations on the board for her. I don't get the sense that the cast of South Pacific loves Sophie, and I think she loses a jury vote to Ozzy or Brandon. Still, I look at Sophie's victory as a classic second-in-command win. I'll rank her here at number 24. At number 23, we have who I consider the best second-in-command winner in Survivor history. This is a contestant who, at points, outplays the dominant strategic figure of his season. The issue is that he intended on rolling to the end with that player where he would have lost. It's Ethan Zohn, the winner of Survivor Africa. Ethan is known as the first Golden Boy winner of Survivor, and that shows when you look at his strategic resume. The cast of Africa adored Ethan to the point where his name is not written down once for the entire season, despite him coming forward as this well-rounded threat in the game. Ethan is well-positioned for this entire season. From the beginning, he's in the core of the majority alliance on the Boron tribe as he connects with Lex and Big Tom. At the swap, Ethan makes a wild play by old-school Survivor standards in throwing the immunity challenge to knock out Silas. That move ensured that Ethan's side would enter the merge with the 6-4 numbers advantage. It's an incredibly impressive strategic idea for that era of the show. At the merge, Ethan's side has the numbers, and they get to work picking off those members of the original Samburu tribe. While Ethan is safe for that entire stretch, I get the sense that Lex was more so the player directing the season and calling the shots. With that said, there are still moments where Ethan gets a leg up over Lex. the biggest being the Brandon vote at the final 8. In that round, Ethan takes out one of Lex's secondary allies, which draws him closer to Ethan's alliance. Ethan eventually reaches the final 4 with his core alliance and Kim Johnson on the outside. My biggest problem with Ethan's game is his outlook on the final tribal council. Ethan wanted to ride with Lex to the end, where according to postseason interviews, Lex beats him. Ethan essentially relies on Kim Johnson winning those last 2 immunity challenges and forcing him to cut his #1 ally. It's important to remember that Kim Johnson's immunity wins were pretty fluky. At Final 4, she wins the Fallen Comrades challenge through a misconception on production's end. Lex provides a correct answer in that challenge, which production mistakenly does not count, and as a result, Kim Johnson wins immunity. Then at Final 3, Lex enters the final immunity challenge with an illness that leads to the second Kim Johnson immunity win. Now, you can definitely credit Ethan for his positioning in the endgame, as every remaining player in Kim, Lex, and Tom all wanted to ride with him to the end. The problem remains, though, that Ethan himself could not recognize his ideal winning combination. We see him defeat Kim Johnson in a 5-2 jury vote, and I bet he beats Big Tom in the final tribal as well. Instead, Ethan works against his best interest and attempts to go to the end with the one player who would have beaten him. So I really considered flipping around the 3 winners in this second-in-command tier. I feel that each of them has a unique positive on their resume. Ethan held the most strategic agency, Aras had the best reputation with the jury, and Sophie maintained the best vision of the endgame. You can rank those 3 in any order, and I'd have no issue with it. Since I'm focusing on dominance in these rankings, I'll put Ethan here at 23 as the best second-in-command player. Here at number 22, we are transitioning from my second-in-command tier to my 6th tier of the list called Co-Dominance. These winners ran their seasons alongside an ally who maintained equal agency. There's 2 big factors directing my perspective on these co-dominant players. First, there's the degree of agency within their alliance, and second, there's win equity in relation to their co-dominant ally. Some of these winners outright beat their #1s in a jury vote, which I find really impressive. So at 22, we have a winner who I have become lower on over time. We covered this season around 2 years ago on the Survivor Analytics podcast. It's Yam Yam Arocho from Survivor 44. Yam Yam, like the other winners in this tier, runs the game alongside a core ally in Carson. The Yam Yam Carson dynamic is probably the biggest knock against Yam Yam's game. First, I'd say that Carson was more instrumental to the success of that Tika 3 alliance. Second, I think that Carson straight up beats Yam Yam in a jury vote, but Yam Yam himself never reaches this realization. Yam Yam attempts to ride with Carson to the final tribal, and at the same time, he's pitching plans to vote out Carolyn, the other member of the Tika 3, who later receives 0 jury votes. Yam Yam's alliance with Carson prevents him from seeing his ideal winning scenarios. While those factors drop Yam Yam to the bottom of this co-dominant tier, everything else surrounding his game is very impressive. From the beginning, he's in the majority on the Tika tribe, as Carson elects to align with him and Carolyn in voting out Helen at their first tribal council. The swap section of the game is a bit of a low point for Yam Yam, where Carolyn goes behind his back to work with Josh, and they knock out Sarah. Carolyn's flip was influenced by Josh's immunity idol, but it's still a moment where Yam Yam loses control of the game. Then there's the merge, where Yam Yam starts a bit slow in those initial 2 tribal councils. At the mergatory, his name is used as the backup vote in the Josh elimination. Yam Yam knew that Josh did not hold an idol, but it's still a negative in that he was at risk of going home there. Then at the split tribal, Yam Yam is thrown into a terrible spot where there are 3 Ratu members in a 5-person tribal council. Yam Yam and Matt are positioned on the bottom, and the Ratu contestants elect to vote out Matt. You could credit this round to Yam Yam's social game, but I see it more as a strategic move by the Ratus to pick off a member of the Soka tribe, as they had the numbers advantage at that point in the season. It's not until the final 10 that the Tika 3 takes control of the game. From that point forward, Yam Yam is safely within the majority, where he maintains substantial agency. Him and Carson actively pit the Ratu and Soka tribes against each other in the early merge. By the final 7, Yam Yam is sitting in a great spot. He still has the Tika 3 alliance, but Yam Yam and Carson establish a new Final 4 deal with Jamie and Lauren. That alliance enables the Tika players to run the endgame, and Yam Yam helps it form through his connection to Jamie. Yam Yam's work in creating that alliance is why I have him in this co-dominant tier rather than the second-in-command tier. By the time Yam Yam reaches the final 6, he's in a spot where he wins the game against any player outside of Carson. As mentioned earlier, the issue with Yam Yam is that he actively tries to take Carson to the end. At Final 4, we see Yam Yam help Carson in firemaking, which Carson luckily loses to Heidi. At the end of the season, Yam Yam defeats Carolyn and Heidi in a 7-1-0 jury vote. I think that a major pro with Yam Yam's game is his win equity. All in all, I think Yam Yam was active enough in the Tika 3 alliance to qualify as a co-dominant winner. His missteps in the early merge, as well as his outlook on the endgame, are still drawbacks on his resume. I'll rank him at the bottom of this tier at number 22. On to number 21, we have another winner that fits well into this co-dominant tier. This player is primarily remembered for barely defeating his co-dominant ally in a jury vote. It's Wendell Holland, the winner of Survivor Ghost Island. Wendell is a perfect example of a co-dominant winner. He runs the game alongside Dom. The question there is, who held more agency in that dynamic? And I lean towards Dom. I feel that there are more rounds of the game where Dom is the player out in front and calling the shots. Most notably, the Chris Noble vote at the final 12 and the Sebastian blindside at the final 6. At the same time, though, Wendell was still a valuable member of that partnership. His connection with Laurel especially benefits their navigation through the season. Laurel receives multiple opportunities to flip against that alliance, and she passes on all of them due to her relationship with Wendell. Without Laurel as an ally, Dom and Wendell would not have been able to dominate that season, which is the main factor pushing Wendell into this co-dominant tier. But looking deeper into Wendell's game, he attends just one tribal council in the entire pre-merge, where he loses his ally Morgan. It's a rough start to the season, but Wendell and Dom are able to recover. At the merge, they win the initial battle against Chris Noble, and from there, they reconnect with the original Navidi tribe and start knocking out the Malolo members. At the split tribal, Wendell does some impressive work in turning Laurel and Kellen against each other. The final 8 is probably the worst round of the season for Wendell, as the women attempt to gather the numbers against him. They're ultimately unsuccessful due to Wendell's connection to Laurel and Donathan. The endgame is also a bit rocky for Wendell, as he has the opportunity to take the shot at Dom at final 6, and he passes it up. Dom, by contrast, takes the shot at Wendell and sends him into firemaking at the final 4 against Angela, which Wendell wins. While it's great that Wendell defeats Angela in that challenge, there's also the negative of Wendell coming forward as a target in the late game. Dom was never blinded by their alliance, and he was fully prepared to flip against him. In the final tribal, Wendell initially ties Dom in the jury vote, but then Laurel steps in and casts the winning vote of the season for Wendell. It's impressive that Wendell could beat his main ally in the final tribal, but he earns that win by the narrowest margins possible. The fact that Wendell needed the tie-breaking rule still holds him back in the ranking. So I look at Wendell's win as a classic co-dominant victory. He's working in the majority for the entire season, and while you can criticize his degree of agency within that group, he maintains the best reputation with the jury. My view of Dom as the head strategic figure of that alliance still factors into the ranking, and it puts Wendell here at number 21. On to number 20, we have the best co-dominant winner in the history of Survivor. I have a feeling that this ranking will be divisive, as some people might describe this winner as individually dominant. But anyways, here at number 20, I got Parvati Shallow with her run on Season 16 Survivor Micronesia. Before diving into Parvati's winning game, I think it's important to start by separating Parvati the Survivor player from Parvati the Survivor winner. I look at Parvati as one of the best contestants to ever compete on Survivor. In my most recent list, I ranked Parvati as the 3rd best player in Survivor history. She's excellent in all 3 facets of the game, and I think that there's a serious argument for Parvati as the greatest player of all time. With that said, I believe that Parvati's win on Micronesia is generally overrated due to her legendary reputation within the franchise. Everyone remembers Parvati for her work within the Black Widow Brigade, an all-women's alliance that runs the post-merge. Parvati deserves credit as the person who brings that group together. She's initially aligned with Cirie and Amanda on the original Favorites tribe, and in the swap section of the game, she connects with Natalie and Alexis. Parvati is unquestionably the architect of the Black Widow Brigade, But what's even more impressive is her positioning within that alliance. As that group runs the show in the post-merge, I feel that Parvati is never seriously at risk of going home. When those women are forced to flip on each other at the final 6, they elect to target Amanda over Parvati, which is insane considering that Parvati later defeats Amanda in a jury vote. Somehow, Parvati pushed Amanda forward as a shield while simultaneously building a stronger reputation with the jury. Parvati's late game positioning on Micronesia is also incredible as she reaches the final tribal no matter who wins the final immunity challenge. We obviously see Amanda taking Parvati to the end, but I think Cirie would have made the same choice. On top of all that, Parvati maintained agency every step of the way this season. She's a pivotal player in taking out Ozzy at the final 9 in a move that solidified Amanda as her #1 ally. She also plays a valuable role in deceiving Eric into giving up immunity at the final 5. These are all factors that shoot Parvati to the top of this co-dominant tier, but I already know that some people will want to see her higher on the list. In fact, I bet Jeff Probst himself would want to rank Parvati higher. During the preseason press for Winners at War, Jeff called Parvati's Micronesia win the most dominant game of Survivor. So here's the anti-Parvati argument. First, her game greatly benefits from factors completely outside her own control, once in the premiere and again in the finale. In the premiere, Parvati is a legitimate target in the first Favorites Tribal Council. She survives that round because Johnny Fairplay quits the game. It's not through the social persuasion of Parvati herself. Without that quit, either Parvati goes home in the first tribal council of the season, or she loses her #1 ally in Amanda off the bat. That's a minor flaw with her win, but to me the biggest problem with Parvati's game is the surprise final 2. Parvati initially rolls to the final 3 with Cirie and Amanda with the expectation that the final tribal council would occur in that round. Instead, production changes the season's format from a final 3 to a final 2 due to a number of medical evacuations sustained earlier on the season. Had Micronesia operated with the final 3, which was the way that Parvati intended, and the established format at that point in Survivor history, Cirie probably wins. In a theoretical Amanda, Parvati, Cirie final tribal council, I think Cirie squeaks out the victory in a 3-2-2 jury vote, where she picks up the votes of Alexis, Eric, and Eliza. The moral of the story here is that Parvati maintained a misguided vision of the endgame. I criticized other winners on this list for the same mistake. Similar to Parvati, Ethan and Yam Yam intended on rolling with their primary allies to the final tribal where they would have lost. The key difference there is that Ethan and Yam Yam never actually took their #1s to that point. Parvati brought Cirie to the final 3, so those luck-based scenarios really lower my opinion of Parvati's win. The other major drawback for me is Parvati's reliance on Cirie. I see Cirie as the strategic mastermind of Survivor Micronesia. We see her directing strategic decisions over Parvati in both the pre-merge and the post-merge. For example, in the second Favorites Tribal Council, Cirie is the player positioned in the middle. She ultimately agrees to work with Parvati's alliance, but only if they knock out her target in Yam Yam. Cirie gets her way there as Yam Yam goes home, and while you could credit Parvati for pulling Cirie onto her side, I think that was more of a strategic move by Cirie herself. Later on in the post-merge, we see Cirie lead votes through the alliance that Parvati created. The most well-known example is the Eric blindside, where Cirie concocts the plan to convince Eric to give up individual immunity. So all in all, I think Parvati plays an impressive game of Survivor. She is the player that assembles the Black Widow Brigade that later dominates the post-merge. In addition, she plays a critical role in numerous votes that set her up for the endgame, like the Ozzy vote at the final 9 and the Alexis elimination at the final 6. However, I think Cirie outplays her, and the fact that Parvati takes Cirie to the final 3 prevents me from ranking this performance higher on the list. She's here at number 20. Moving ahead to number 19, we are starting a new tier on the list called Flawed Dominance. This is the largest tier, encompassing a total of 9 contestants. All of these players served as the head strategic figure for most of their respective seasons. However, each of them comes with their own major drawback. Some of these winners benefited from production-infused gimmicks, others relied on more traditional mechanics like immunity challenge wins or hidden immunity idols. Regardless, all of these players lost control for part of the season, but for not as long as those winners in my section dominance tier. So here at number 19, we have the worst winner within this flawed dominance tier. This is a player who held more agency than many of the people ahead of him on the list, but he also relied more on production interference in clearing his path to victory. It's Yul Kwon, the winner of Survivor Cook Islands. Now, I love Yul as both a Survivor character as well as a Survivor player. He's just outside my top 10 contestants of all time. Yul the winner is a different story. I think there's an argument for Yul as one of the luckiest winners in Survivor history due to the sheer number of outside factors facilitating his win. We can hit on those luck-based scenarios at the beginning. First, there's the bottle twist in the pre-merge, which forces the opposing Raro tribe to vote out 2 contestants in a single tribal council. Without that twist, Yul's side enters the merge down in numbers 6-4, and Penner no longer has an incentive to flip over. In that case, there is a real chance that Yul is voted out in the early merge as the Ratus take control. Second, there's Yul's Super Idol, which could be played after the votes are read aloud. Yul finds this idol in episode 2, and he does not attend a single tribal council all season where he is technically vulnerable. While it's impressive that Yul was able to use that idol to push the target in another direction, it's important to recognize that this version of the idol is one of the most overpowered twists in the history of the show, especially given its expiration date. Yul's idol could be played through the Final Four in a season that featured the first 3-person Final Tribal Council. This means that Yul never attended a tribal without that built-in safety net. Third, potentially the biggest detractor from Yul's winning game is the surprise Final 3. Cook Islands was the first season to pivot away from a 2-person Final Tribal Council. Had this season operated with the Final 2, which Yul himself expected, then Ozzy likely wins final immunity, and there's a chance that Yul gets voted out in 3rd place. I still don't know for sure what Ozzy would have done in that situation. There are hints in the edit suggesting that Ozzy is a competitor at his core, who would want to face off with the best in the end. So I could see Ozzy riding with Yul to the final tribal council, but it's not a slam dunk by any means. Those 3 factors definitely drop my opinion of Yul as a winner, but that doesn't take away from his degree of agency throughout Cook Islands. Yul functions as the leader of the dominant power structure in every tribal council. In the pre-merge, Yul adapts to a constantly changing field as he survives both a tribe swap and the mutiny twist, which removed 2 of his allies in Penner and Candace. Through all that chaos, Yul serves as the godfather of the I2 tribe, where he and Becky handpick those contestants for the next stage of the game. You could definitely criticize Yul for his willingness to work with Candace in that swap section of the pre-merge, as she later betrays him at the mutiny twist, but at the same time, Yul perpetually campaigns to keep Jonathan around, which pays major dividends in the merge. At the final 9, Yul pulls off the most iconic move of the season in using the immunity idol to convince Jonathan to flip back over to his side. That play gave Yul's alliance the 5-4 numbers advantage, and they controlled the game seamlessly from there. At Final 7, Yul makes the crucial deal with Adam, where Yul agrees to vote out Jonathan, and in return, Adam guarantees Yul his jury vote. That move by Yul later wins him the season, and I respect him for making that tough decision. Jonathan was an easy beat in the end, but Yul knew that it would have been too difficult to drag him that far. Then at the Final 5, Yul has his best social maneuver of the season, where he convinces Ozzy and Sandra to vote against Adam instead of flushing the idol. When the numbers dwindle to just the I2-4, Yul maintains his alliance with Becky and Sandra, who were both determined to ride with him to the final tribal. In other words, Yul was positioned at the center of that I2 alliance. That trio was prepared to vote out Ozzy on multiple occasions. If Ozzy doesn't pull off the best physical game in the history of the show, Yul takes him out, rolls with Sandra and Becky to the end, and likely wins in a unanimous jury vote. Instead, Yul faces off against Ozzy and Becky in the final tribal council. He narrowly wins in a 5-4-0 jury vote. I don't think that people talk about this enough, but Yul won Survivor in an era that focused more on the physical side of the game. The general perception of juries at this time favored contestants like Ozzy, yet Yul still won. So I really admire Yul's control in navigating through Cook Islands. If not for those instances of production interference benefiting Yul, his win likely ranks somewhere in the top 10. At the end of the day, though, there's just too many outside factors elevating this victory. I'll put it here at number 19. On to number 18, I have a winner who I feel is overhated by the Survivor community due to her surrounding edit. It's Erika from Survivor 41. When I first watched Survivor 41, I did not understand the Erika win at all. At the time, Erika came across as a luck-based winner who never held much strategic agency. The edit of 41 goes out of its way to portray Erika in a negative light, while postseason interviews revealed that Erika played a great game. There are multiple instances of the show misrepresenting Erika's positioning. In the pre-merge, we get the entire storyline of Luvu attempting to throw an immunity challenge to knock out Erika. We learn after the season that the actual target for that challenge was Sydney. Then in the early merge, the show emphasizes this idea that Erika was on the bottom and she was the likely target prior to the hourglass twist. In reality, Erika was well insulated prior to that gimmick, and she came forward as a target because she was isolated from the rest of the tribe. The twist itself painted the target on Erika, not her social gameplay. If you look past those moments on 41, Erika is in a great spot every step of the way. From the jump, she's in the majority on the Luvu tribe, locking down Heather as the #1 ally, while also building connections with Deshawn. Luvu wins every pre-merge immunity challenge, but had they attended a tribal council, Erika is more than likely safe. Then in the early merge, Erika works in the majority alliance, but she's not the one calling the shots. That stretch between the final 12 and the final 8 is the flaw in Erika's game that places her within this tier. The most impactful vote of the season happens in that section of the game. At Final 8, Ricard leads the Sham blindside, effectively cutting the head person of the Black Players Alliance. That move really opened up Erika's long-term options, but I take fault with the fact that Erika wasn't the one leading the vote. Starting at the final 7, Erika dominates the rest of the season. She still has her #1 in Heather, and she builds new bonds with the likes of Ricard and Xander. At final 6, she leads the charge against Danny. Then at final 5, she has Ricard as a shield to cut in the late game. The fact that Ricard took credit for the Sham boot was actually great for Erika. Obviously, there's the downside of Ricard potentially beating Erika in a jury vote, but at the same time, Erika always had the numbers in place to knock out Ricard. It was just a matter of finding the ideal round to pull the trigger. When Erika reaches the final 4 against Deshawn, Xander, and Heather, she stands as the biggest jury threat on the board. Erika had one of the best social games on the island, and I think she wins most final tribal council combinations. When Xander wins final immunity, he elects to take Erika to the final tribal council, which is a major testament to her threat level management. She was the last person that Xander should have brought to the end. I look at that move by Erika as one of the best social plays of the new era. She then defeats Xander and Deshawn in a 7-1-0 jury vote, so I understand that some people might take issue with this ranking, especially if you do not follow any of the postseason media coverage. I look at Erika as a dominant winner of Survivor, someone that took control of the game in the back half and positioned herself well once in power. I'll put her here at number 18. At number 17, I have someone who really dominated his season from beginning to end. There's just one major asterisk on his win that drops him to this spot. It's Tyson Apostol with his run on Season 27, Survivor Blood vs. Water. With Tyson, we have a winner that's in control for the entire season. While there's some brutal low points where Tyson nearly goes home, I need to credit him as one of the most powerful winners within this tier. In the pre-merge, Tyson's loved one is voted out of the opposing tribe, and he uses that information to his benefit, aligning with the other contestants who lost their loved ones like Jervis and Monica. Tyson's stranglehold on the game really comes forward at the swap, where he connects with some of the new players in Hayden, Caleb, and Sierra. Those alliances give Tyson the numbers to flip against Aras at the merge. Prior to that round, it felt like Tyson and Aras were competing for the spot as the dominant strategic figure of the season, and Tyson won that battle due to his active social work. With Aras out of the game, Tyson knocks out the remnants of that alliance, taking out Vitas and Tina. And then we get to the final 7, where Tyson solidifies his path to the end. While Caleb and Hayden initially target Tyson, he's able to trick them into flipping their votes on Sierra. He then blindsides Caleb, which sets himself up nicely at the final 6, with a 4-person alliance consisting of himself, Jervis, Monica, and Sierra. The final 6 tribal council is the main detractor from Tyson's win. In that round, Tyson makes 2 crucial mistakes. First, he loses the support of Sierra, who flips to force a 3-3 tie. Second, by failing to anticipate the Sierra flip, Tyson does not play his immunity idol, which is a massive blunder on his end. As a result, Tyson is forced to participate in a rock draw where he has a 1 out of 3 chance of going home. Most of the winners ahead of Tyson on this list did not rely on pure chance to the same degree. I'd also note that Tyson gets very lucky in that Jervis won the final 6 immunity challenge. Had someone else in the opposing group won immunity, then there is a 2/3 chance of Tyson's side losing that rock draw. At the end of the day, the rock draw plays out in Tyson's favor as Katie gets knocked out of the game. After that round, Tyson coasts through the rest of the season with Jervis and Monica. The only wrench thrown into Tyson's endgame was Tina returning through the Redemption Island twist. Tina goes to the final 4, where if she won the final immunity challenge, Tyson is in serious danger. With that said, I think that if Tyson still found a way to the final tribal, he beats Tina in a jury vote. I know that people always say that Tina wins blood versus water if she sits in the end, but I disagree. In that scenario, I see a 4-4 tie between Tina and Tyson, with the final member of the jury, either Jervis or Monica, voting in favor of Tyson. In reality, Tina loses that challenge, and she's voted out, which puts Tyson in his ideal final tribal council combination against Jervis and Monica. There, Tyson nearly sweeps the jury, earning 7 out of 8 jury votes. It's worth noting that some members of that jury, particularly Aras and Vitas, are very bitter towards Tyson. So all in all, I think that Tyson dominates the strategic direction of this season, but that rock draw really damages my outlook on this win. I'll put Tyson here at number 17. At number 16, we have arguably the best winning game in Survivor history from a physical perspective. It's Tom Westman, the winner of Survivor Palau. When I think of Tom's win, my mind immediately jumps to his challenge dominance. I don't factor immunity wins too much into my rankings, but it's worth noting that Tom was a challenge beast on this season. Tom serves as the head physical force of his Koror tribe, which wins every immunity challenge in the pre-merge. Then in the post-merge, Tom wins 5 out of 7 individual immunities. Tom and Mike Holloway are the only winners on this list that are a part of the Elite 5-Timers Club. As for Tom's strategic game, I think that Tom was a player that controlled the direction of the season up until the final 5. Early on, Tom operates at the center of the Koror majority. He creates this stable power structure where himself and Ian align with the pairing of Greg and Jen. At the same time, Tom does some really impressive work in connecting with an outsider in Karen, who remain completely loyal to Tom throughout the post-merge. There are multiple instances on Palau where a group of players attempt to pull the numbers against Tom and Ian, and they are unsuccessful because Karen refuses to flip against Tom. In the early merge, Tom and Ian continue to sit in the power seat, taking out the periphery players in Colby and Stephanie. Then at the final 6, we see some great long-term strategic thinking from Tom. In that round, he recognizes that the pair of Greg and Jen are plotting to flip against him, and he enacts the move to take out Greg instead. In that process, Tom pushes Ian forward as the player to strong-arm Katie into following their plan. Pretty impressive work from Tom there in getting his way while simultaneously damaging the Ian-Katie alliance. Tom's navigation through the first 75% of the season is incredible, but then we get to the final 5 where everything kind of falls apart for Tom. I feel that Tom forfeits a lot of control to Ian in the endgame. At final 5, Tom makes the ridiculous decision to vote out Karen, who was hated by the jury and fully loyal to Tom himself. She was the perfect player for Tom to drag to the end, yet he willingly gives her up. By the final 4, Ian had gathered the numbers to take out Tom. Had Tom lost immunity at final 4 or final 3, he's voted out, which hurts the overall quality of this win. Luckily for Tom, he wins both of those challenges. I will credit Tom for his manipulation of Ian in the endgame. He tricks Ian into admitting that he was gunning for Tom at Final 4. This pushes Tom to force a fire-making challenge between Ian and Jen, which Ian wins. Then at Final 3, Tom convinces Ian to drop out of the final immunity challenge in order to maintain their friendship. So while Tom's safety for those last 2 rounds is a concern, I still think that his navigation through those spots is solid. Tom then sits against Katie in the final tribal, where he easily wins in a 6-1 jury vote. One of the best aspects of Tom's season is his win equity. I fully believe that Tom beats just about anyone in a jury vote. The problem for Tom was never impressing the jury, it was finding a way to the final tribal. To be fair though, Tom's pathway to the final tribal was pretty narrow, and it seemed like no one in the endgame, outside of maybe Karen, actually wanted to roll with him that far in the season. So I look at Tom's win as a really powerful game, one where Tom operates as the head of the majority alliance. At the end of the day though, Tom's power felt somewhat artificial due to his immunity wins. It seems like the other players were working with Tom because he was always safe. The second that Tom was vulnerable, those supposed allies were prepared to turn against him. It's still an upper tier win. I'll rank Tom here at number 16. On to number 15, we got a player whose winning arc is similar to Tom Westman's in that he runs the show up until those last couple rounds where his number 1 ally takes control and gathers the numbers against him. It's JT Thomas with his game on Season 18 Survivor Tocantins. My opinion of JT's win has declined over time. As early as last year, I looked at this game as one of the 10 most dominant performances in the history of the show. That perspective stemmed from JT's social prowess. JT is adored by the surrounding Tocantins cast, to the point where he has players like Brendan willingly throwing their games away to help him progress through the season. JT eventually sits in the final tribal council against arguably the second best jury threat in Steven, and he still crushes Steven in the jury vote. JT was the golden boy of Survivor Tocantins, and I think that he likely defeats any other player in a final tribal council. All of this is to say that I look at JT's run here as one of the best social games of all time, but he has some missteps along the way. In the pre-merge, JT locks down his primary alliance with Steven and Taj. That trio runs the Jalapao tribe through the first 7 episodes of the season. JT then enters the merge of Tocantins in a pretty precarious position as his side is outnumbered 6-3 against the opposing Tambira tribe. JT easily could have been picked off in that early merge section of the game, but he gets to work, building new alliances with key members of Tambira like Coach, Brendan, and Tyson. Those connections enable the Jalapao 3 to bounce between factions of the Tambira tribe, dismantling their group from the inside. Throughout the Jalapao's success, JT serves as the face of the operation. He is the player maintaining those various alliances, which prevents the Tambiras from regrouping. So while JT worked as the social connector of that Jalapao alliance, I always saw Steven more as the head strategic thinker of that group. Steven's true control of the game is revealed through the boot order of the Tambiras. Steven convinces JT to knock out many of their secondary pawns in the game before Steven lets go of his own. JT willingly cuts loyal allies like Brendan at the final 9 and Coach at the final 5. Instead, JT and Steven roll with Aaron to the final 3, who was the only Tambira player in the post-merge who never bought into the hype surrounding JT. Had JT lost that final immunity challenge, Aaron and Steven band together to vote him out, and Steven is the winner of the season. The fact that JT actively put himself in a more difficult position in that last round of the game takes away from this win. Even though I look at Steven as the better strategic member of that partnership, JT still proves his strategic side independent of Steven. At Final 5, JT walks into Tribal Council knowing that there were already 3 locked votes against Coach. In response, JT does not vote against Coach, knowing that Coach will respect him for it, and that move later materializes in Coach's jury vote. Now, I still disagree with the decision by JT to cut Coach in the first place, but his approach to that elimination is still impressive. But anyways, JT ends up sweeping Steven in a jury vote, giving him the first perfect game in Survivor history. Out of the 2 perfect games seen on Survivor, I feel that JT's win has a stronger legacy behind it, but I favor Cochran's win on Karamoan, which we'll hit on later. Overall, everything outside those last couple rounds are great for JT, but I struggle to look past the fact that he actively positioned himself poorly in the end. I'll rank him here at number 15. At number 14, we will continue to work through this flawed dominance tier with a winner that I see as one of the best players in the history of Survivor. It's the cop that learned to play like a criminal. It's Sarah Lacina from Survivor Game Changers. I don't think that Sarah was as outwardly dominant as some of the previous winners, especially in the pre-merge. Sarah attends just 2 tribal councils in the early game, but it feels like she does not hold a lot of agency in the votes against Sandra and Varner. Then in the early merge, Sandra kind of coasts within the majority alliance. The final 11 is the point in the season where Sarah really starts to shine. From that round forward, Sarah pulls off one of the most fluid and dynamic games ever seen on the show. Her post-merge is one where she's always in the middle, bouncing between various groups. At final 11, Sarah flips to knock out Debbie. Then at final 9, Sierra reveals her legacy advantage to Sarah. Sarah responds by pushing the vote onto Sierra, knowing that Sierra would will her the advantage. That move not only serves as a secret stamp on her resume, but it enables her to lock in a final 3 deal with Brad and Troyzan. Sarah continues to work as an essential strategic figure in the mid-merge, flipping the vote onto Andrea at the final 8 in a move that seriously damaged Cirie's long-term prospects. At final 7, Sierra weakens Cirie again, this time taking Michaela out of the game. But then we reach the final 6, and this is the round that drops Sarah into this flawed dominance tier. There we see the first ever advantage get-in on Survivor, as every player at Tribal Council other than Cirie earns immunity either through the immunity necklace or immunity idols. Everyone remembers Cirie's iconic exit in that episode, but many people forget that the majority of votes landed on Sarah. While you can credit Sarah for her active work in acquiring that legacy advantage, I still take issue with the fact that she needed immunity in that round. That vote also forces me to question Sarah's loyalty to Cirie. Sarah had the opportunity to turn against Cirie earlier in the season when there were obvious signs that Cirie would not remain loyal in the long run. For example, Cirie attempts to use Sarah's vote steal at the final 7 against Sarah's wishes. But once Cirie is out of the game, Sarah dominates the remainder of the season. Her alliance with Troyzan and Brad remains loyal through those last 2 rounds, knocking out Aubrey followed by Ty. Sarah then sits in her ideal final Tribal Council combination where she wins in a 7-3-0 jury vote. Although there were some members of the jury who felt bitter towards Sarah, particularly Ozzy and Debbie, I still believe that Sarah maintained a lot of win equity. She probably beats Ty or Aubrey had either of them sat in the end. So Sarah's win on Game Changers is one of the more unique wins in the history of the show. It's rare that you see someone succeed with that flip-flopping strategy, but Sarah executes that plan almost to perfection. Unfortunately, that final 6 tribal needs to affect Sarah's placement, so I'll put her here at number 14. At number 13, we got a winner from one of Survivor's most strategically complex seasons. It's Jeremy Collins from Season 31, Survivor Cambodia. I feel that Jeremy's season-long statistics actually downplay his degree of dominance. While Jeremy technically votes correctly in around 73% of his tribal councils, there's a lot of wonky circumstances affecting that number. Jeremy's run on Second Chance in many ways is the improved version of his game on San Juan del Sur. In both of those seasons, Jeremy positions himself as the head strategist within the dominant power structure. The difference between those games are the loyalty of Jeremy's alliances and his use of shields. Jeremy is oftentimes remembered for his incorporation of the meat shield strategy, where he strings along players like Savage and Joe, knowing that they will come forward as major targets before Jeremy himself. That strategy enables Jeremy to survive tribal councils even when luck-based scenarios do not break his way. At Final 12, you have the historic Kelly Wentworth idol play, which gives all of the power to a 3-person minority alliance, and they elect to knock out Savage over Jeremy. The Wentworth idol play is not the only time where Jeremy is outwitted by another alliance. At Final 10, a group bands together against Jeremy's #1 ally in Steven. Jeremy learns about the play plan, and he saves Steven with an immunity idol. It's a flashy move at Tribal Council, but it's also one where Jeremy is relying on production-infused advantages to get his way. I'd also throw out that Jeremy's idol play does little to even shake up the tribal dynamics. He's blindsided by the Steven vote in the following round. So that stretch between the final 12 and final 9 is pretty rough for Jeremy, but he recovers at the final 8, locking in this 4-person alliance with Tasha, Kimmy, and Spencer. That group works together to vote out the challenge beast of the season in Joe, followed by the villain of the season in Abby Maria. But then we get to the final 6, which is probably the lowest point of Jeremy's winning game. There we see Kimmy gather the numbers against Jeremy, and Jeremy cannot anticipate Kimmy's betrayal. He relies on the strategic reads of Spencer, who convinces him to not split the vote, which ends up saving Jeremy at Tribal Council. The final 6 Tribal Council of Cambodia is one of the strangest votes in the history of the show. Jeremy's trio ends up winning the battle, but their victory is facilitated by Spencer winning individual immunity. Had any member of the opposing alliance won immunity in that round, Jeremy's side loses the numbers, and Jeremy is in serious danger going into the final 5. I discredited previous winners like JT and Tom for their reliance on immunity wins, and Jeremy's final 6 might be worse because he depended on an ally winning the challenge. It's an instance of Jeremy progressing in the game through factors outside his control. Jeremy picks it up at the final 5, where he's the swing vote in taking out Keith. At final 4, Jeremy is well positioned with Wentworth isolated as an obvious target. Jeremy is in a spot where he wins the season as long as Wentworth does not win final immunity. Had Wentworth won that last challenge, it's a tight race between her and Jeremy in the final tribal, but I do give the slight nod to Wentworth. That's something to definitely take issue with Jeremy's game. He was not the jury's favorite remaining player. While I think he wins most final Tribal Council combinations, it's not great that he nearly reaches the end in a losing situation. In reality, Wentworth loses final immunity, and Jeremy faces Tasha and Spencer in the final Tribal Council, where he sweeps the jury. Jeremy is just one of 5 winners in Survivor history to earn every possible jury vote. So I look at Jeremy's Cambodia run as a very solid game. In my first edition of this list, I actually had Jeremy 3 spots higher. I ultimately decided to drop him a bit because there's just too many points in the season where he loses control. Combine that with the wonky final 6 Tribal Council, and I'll rank Jeremy here at number 13. Then at number 12, we have the highest rated new era winner on this list, in Dee Valladares from Survivor 45. We covered this season on the Survivor Analytics podcast, and I remember watching Dee's navigation through the game and clocking it as one of the best wins in the history of the show. Dee was trending towards a top 5 winning game. If not for her blunders at the final 5, she would have ranked considerably higher on the list. Outside that Tribal Council, Dee plays a dominant game of Survivor, one where she's calling the shots from the majority. In the pre-merge, she locks in the Reba 4 alliance, where she has Julie and Austin as 2 fully loyal allies. In the first Reba Tribal Council, Dee technically votes incorrectly as she casts her vote against Sifu over Sean, but I don't fault Dee much for that round, given the circumstances surrounding Sean's pseudo-quit. That move puts Dee in a bit of hot water as Sifu works to find the player that voted against him, but she ultimately convinces Sifu that it was not her. Later on at the Split Tribal, Dee works as the head strategic figure in taking Caleb out of the game. That round also marks the point in the season where Dee aligns with Keturah, which contributes to the collapse of the Bellow tribe at the merge. Through the early merge, Dee's Reba alliance stays in control, knocking out Kelly, followed by Kendra, followed by Bruce. Dee is well positioned for that entire stretch with legitimate agency, as she learns that Kendra is throwing out her name at Final 9, and she pushes the target in that direction. At the same time, it's important to remember that the Reba 4's power does not originate from Dee herself. That group takes control through the social work of Austin and Drew, who picked up Emily as a number in the swap section of the game. It's a minor knock against Dee's win, but still worth noting as we're splitting hairs towards the top of the list. It's not until the final 7 that Dee really grabs the game by the horns. In that round, she pulls off one of the best strategic moves of the new era as she learns that Julie is the target and she shares that information with Julie, which enables Julie to play her idol at tribal council, sending Emily home instead. The best part of that move is the fact that Dee still voted with the majority against Julie as a way to hide their alliance. Dee walks into the final 6 with 3 contestants in Drew, Austin, and Julie, who all wanted to ride with her to the end. Then at final 6, Dee gets a leg up over Austin by blindsiding his #1 ally in Drew. I think that vote helps Dee a lot in making her case against Austin in the final tribal, and that takes us to the final 5, which is a near disaster for Dee. There, we see Jake concoct this plan to use his idol on Katurah and flip the vote onto Dee. Dee is about to get sent out of the game, but then Katurah gets paranoid in the voting booth and she casts her vote onto Julie instead. Obviously, every winner benefits from the misplay of their competitors, but this is an instance where Dee really banks on Katurah dropping the ball at the 11th hour. Dee's final 4 is not particularly great either, as every remaining contestant planned on throwing her into the fire-making challenge. It doesn't matter though, as Dee wins final immunity, and she makes the correct decision of bringing Austin to the end as a way to prevent him from building his resume with a fire-making win. Dee walks into that final tribal against Austin and Jake with, in my opinion, a far superior strategic resume, yet she barely squeaks out the win, earning 5 out of 8 jury votes. Her final tribal performance is pretty rough at points. She burns Bruce, which contributes to him voting in favor of Austin. So while Dee stumbles her way through those last couple rounds, I think that the rest of her game is all very impressive, easily the best winning game of the new era. I'll rank it here at number 12. At number 11, at the top of this flawed dominance tier, we have a winner who has an argument for the best post-merge game in Survivor history. It's Natalie Anderson from Survivor San Juan del Sur. In researching winners for this project, Natalie was one of those contestants who moved up my rankings. I feel that the general knock against Natalie's run on season 29 is the first half of her game. Through the entire pre-merge and early merge, Natalie was not really the one out in front calling the shots. She works primarily alongside Jeremy Collins, who seemingly maintained more connections outside their alliance. I see Jeremy more so as the head strategic player in that partnership. Still, Natalie is in the majority on her original Hanapu tribe, and she contributes to the Drew vote in episode 4. The swap section of the game is not great for Natalie, even though she does not attend a tribal council. Natalie and Jeremy are positioned towards the bottom of their tribe, so they get pretty lucky in that they win both immunity challenges. Had they gone to tribal council, there is a chance that Jeremy gets taken out, which definitely impacts Natalie's trajectory on the season. Then in the early merge, Natalie's side wins the initial battle, knocking out Josh at final 11. There, Natalie is on the right side of the vote, but she's not the one directing the season. The pair of Jacqueline and John operate the middle, and they elect to work with Natalie's group because Jeremy won individual immunity. You can follow that up with the final 10, where Natalie is blindsided by the Jeremy vote. She's completely out of the loop there, which places her in this flawed dominance tier. So again, for the first 9 episodes of the season, Natalie's game is fine. It doesn't hit the same severe low points as the other winners in this tier. Even Natalie's worst tribal council is one where she does not have her name written down as Jeremy is taken out over her. I think that Natalie was much safer through her flawed section of the game, especially when you compare it to other winners in this tier who likely get voted out if not for challenge wins or idol plays. The final 9 is where Natalie's game starts to turn back around. She rebuilds her relationship with John and Jacqueline. She rebuilds her relationship with Missy and Baylor. Those connections put Natalie back into the majority. We see her in the loop on the West Blind side. She actually plays a valuable role there in convincing John to play his idol. That move solidifies Natalie's bond with John and Jacqueline, which enables her to flip against John later in the season. The final 7 is where Natalie's game launches into an elite tier. From that point forward, Natalie pulls off some of the most impressive strategic moves in the history of the show. In that round, there's this original plan to split the vote between Keith and Alec. Natalie identifies Alec as the player less loyal to her, so she flips and knocks him out in a 4-3 vote. What's even crazier is that after Tribal Council, Natalie successfully convinces her alliance that she voted against Alec by accident. That move preserved Keith as an ally and shield who she would use later in the game. Then at Final 6, Natalie enacts her revenge, serving as the head strategic figure in the John blindside. Then at Final 5, Natalie takes Baylor out of the game in one of the best idol plays in Survivor history. By playing her idol on Jacqueline in that tribal council, Natalie leaves herself as one of just 3 vulnerable contestants. Natalie was so well insulated socially that she could afford to utilize her idol on another player, knowing that she would survive the tribal council regardless. That move sets up Natalie perfectly at the Final 4 because it broke up the pair of Missy and Baylor. That mother-daughter duo would never turn on each other. So if Natalie rolled with them and Keith into the next round, she would be banking on Keith losing final immunity. Instead, by going to the Final 4 with no pairs of loved ones, Natalie positions herself in the middle. She is in a spot where Keith, Jacqueline, and Missy all intend on bringing her to the end, and she wins in any combination. Natalie's shield strategy works out perfectly at the Final 4, where they take out Keith, and she sits in the end against Jacqueline and Missy, where she wins the season in a 5-2-1 jury vote. That final tally actually undersells Natalie's social game. Of the 3 jury votes that Natalie loses, 2 of them were from jury members voting for their loved ones, and the other was Reed, who only voted for Jacqueline as a way to deny Missy second place. So even though Natalie's dominance is delayed to the second half of the game, I think her navigation through that stretch is some of the most impressive strategic work ever seen on Survivor. It'll put her here at the number 11 spot. On to number 10, we can jump into the second to last tier of this list called Majority Dominance. These winners held strategic agency for just about the entire season. They direct the game to their winning combination with a couple small bumps in the road. Some of these winners forfeited control temporarily, while others are blindsided by production-infused advantages. These winners differ from those in the flawed dominance tier in that they are never in serious danger of going home, and they are rarely excluded from the consensus plan. Then at number 10, we got a winner who has an argument for the most strategically dominant performance in the history of the show. That's enough to put this winner in the top 10, but his atrocious social game holds him back from the highest tier of this list. It's Brian Heidik, the winner of Survivor Thailand. On this season, we see Brian perfect old-school Survivor strategy. He follows that blueprint of forming a stable alliance within his original tribe, voting out every member of the opposing tribe in the early merge, then navigating to the end with his core allies. What distinguishes Brian from other old-school winners is his degree of control within his primary alliance. Every person in that group genuinely considered Brian their number 1 ally, and as a result, his name is not written down once this entire season. Out of the gate, Brian locks down his main alliance on the Chewigon tribe with the likes of Ted, Helen, Jan, and Clay. In episode 7, production runs the weird fake merge twist where he's initially in a 5-5 split according to original tribal lines. Before the reveal of that fake merge, Brian actually convinces Cheyenne to flip over to his side, so he was prepared to take control of the game even if production elected to not include that twist. We get the real merge at Final 8, where Brian's side holds the 5-3 numbers advantage, and they pick off every member of the original Sukjai tribe in Ken, then Penny, then Jake. By the Final 5, Brian is very socially insulated, as every remaining player intends on rolling with him to the final tribal. He cuts Ted at 5, then at Final 4, he makes an interesting play in voting out Helen. When I first watched Thailand, I disagreed with that decision by Brian. In my mind, Brian should have taken Helen to the Final 3 alongside Clay because Helen and Clay despised each other. With that hypothetical trio, Brian would guarantee himself a spot in the final tribal council. That's all great, but the issue with that approach is Brian's relatively lower winning stock. If Helen won final immunity and brought Brian to the end, she probably beats him in a jury vote. Brian's goal at Final 4 was to maximize his chances of reaching the end in his only winning scenario against Clay. By cutting Helen at 4, Brian takes 53-year-old Jan to the Final 3, who would likely lose that final immunity challenge. That plan works out perfectly as Brian wins final immunity, takes Clay to the final tribal, and narrowly wins the season in a 4-3 jury vote. From a strictly strategic perspective, this is an all-time win. but Bryan's jury management needs to impact this ranking. Despite presenting a way better strategic resume, Bryan barely beats Clay, who was hated by the Thailand jury. Bryan probably loses most other Final Tribal Council combinations. He made zero real effort to connect with any members of the Chuigan tribe. All 3 of them vote for Clay in the Final Tribal. While Bryan earns all 4 of the Sukjai tribe's votes, even those felt shaky. In case you don't know, there were rumors postseason that Bryan made racial remarks on the island that were nearly brought up by Ken at the Final Tribal. If Ken comes forward with that information, Bryan potentially loses Ted's vote, which costs him the win. Clay is widely regarded as one of the worst finalists in the history of the show, so it's ridiculous that this jury vote was that close. I think that Bryan's Thailand game has a real argument for the worst winning social game in the history of the show. At the end of the day, I need to fall back on my criteria for this list. At their core, these are strategically centric rankings, which elevates Bryan all the way to the number 10 spot. At number 9, I got the final winner on this list from old school Survivor in Tina Wesson, the winner of Survivor the Australian Outback. Tina is one of those winners that shot up my rankings through my research for this project. In my initial draft for this list, I had Tina around 10 spots lower. My original concern with Tina's game was her outlook on her strategic dominance. While Tina is in control for all of Season 2, she perceives Survivor through this moral lens. Tina justifies many of her voting decisions by claiming that she wants to bring deserving people to the end. As far as the edit is concerned, Tina does not look at Survivor with much strategic forethought. Now, it's important to acknowledge the cultural expectations surrounding this early season. In the first season of the show, Richard Hatch was painted as a villain for his strategic outlook on the game. There is a chance that Tina kept her strategic perspective a secret as a way to maintain her reputation. At the end of the day, though, I don't know if Tina's intent really matters. She still runs the game from beginning to end, which is enough to earn her a spot in this majority dominance tier. Early on, Tina is on the outside of the Okokor tribe, but she works to create a stable power structure. In their third tribal council, she has a really impressive move in convincing Colby to flip to work with her and Keith in taking out Mitchell. After that vote, Tina has this 5-person Onion alliance set in stone where she is positioned in the middle. Tina then enters the merge tied in numbers against the opposing Kucha alliance. Now, it's important to remember that Michael Skupin was medically evacuated from the Kucha tribe in the last episode of the pre-merge. Without that medevac, there is a chance that Tina's tribe loses the immunity challenge and she walks into the merge down in numbers where she's likely picked off. So that's a luck-based scenario that breaks Tina's way. But anyways, at the merge, Tina makes an insightful play in throwing the immunity challenge to her ally Keith. At that point in Survivor history, tied votes were broken based on the number of previous votes received. Tina knew that Keith had his name written down more times than anyone else in her alliance. So by helping him win that challenge, she increased the odds of her side winning that initial battle. That goes exactly according to plan as the Okokor alliance takes control and votes out members of the opposing tribe in Varner, followed by Alicia. Going into the final 8, I expected Tina to continue picking off those bottom feeders, but she pivots and knocks out Jerry from her own alliance. Part of me appreciates that Tina was willing to deviate a bit from the old school Survivor approach of voting out every member of the opposing tribe before cannibalizing your own. At the same time, by taking out Jerry at 8, Tina's Okokor group barely maintains the 4-3 numbers advantage in the following round. One of Tina's allies was Amber, who was very close with Jerry. There was a real risk there of Amber responding and flipping against Tina. Obviously, that doesn't happen, but I don't know if Amber's loyalty was based more in Amber's connection to Tina or the timing of this season. At this point in Survivor history, we had never seen a player completely flip against their primary alliance, which likely factored into Amber's decision. At the end of the day, Amber sticks by Tina's side, and from there, Tina is able to vote out those players on the periphery and navigate to the final 3 with her core allies of Colby and Keith. Arguably, the best aspect of Tina's win is her late-game positioning, where both Keith and Colby intended on bringing her to the end, and she defeats either of them in a jury vote. However, those endgame scenarios are not equal. Tina narrowly beats Colby in a 4-3 jury vote, whereas she potentially sweeps the jury against Keith. Even though Keith is clearly the easier beat in the end, Tina intended on rolling with Colby to the final tribal, which is a concern for me. Overall, I feel that Tina played a dominant game of Survivor. She orchestrates the vote against Mitchell in the pre-merge, which sets herself up with a path to the end once her side gained the numbers advantage. You can definitely fault Tina for either her reasoning behind her decisions or simply the strategic level of the surrounding cast, but those negatives are relatively minor for me. When you look at Tina's performance on paper, there is never a round where she's out of the loop or following the strategic decisions of her allies. It's the best winning game of old school Survivor. It ranks her here at number 9. Then at number 8, I have who I consider the most underrated winner in the history of Survivor. I put this contestant in the top 10 of my player ranking because this winning game is so impressive. It's Tommy Sheehan, the winner of Survivor Island of the Idols. I feel that Tommy's win on IOI is defined by his adaptability. This is a game where Tommy is constantly thrown into unlucky scenarios through circumstances outside his control. Tommy makes the best of those spots, and he still dominates the season strategically. Tommy gets his way in almost every tribal council. Off the bat, he's in the majority of the Vokai tribe, which takes out Molly in their first tribal council. At the swap, Tommy is pushed into a tribe of 8 where there was an even 4-4 split. There, he convinces the opposing Lyro contestants to flip on their own in taking out Aaron. Tommy had the numbers in place for that move, but it's ultimately blown up by Elaine receiving a vote block on the Island of the Idols. That advantage enables Elaine to flip the vote onto Jason, one of Tommy's closest allies. That pre-merge tribal is the only point in the season where Tommy loses control. It's still a knock against him, but it's also a round that was heavily influenced by advantages which Tommy could not account for. Following that vote, Tommy is not in the best position. That swap tribe does not attend another pre-merge tribal council, but had that happened, Tommy potentially receives some votes. Tommy's game flips at the merge, and everything from that point forward is completely directed by him. I know that the common criticism with Tommy is that his number 1 ally Lauren ran the show, and he served as her second in command. I fully disagree with that outlook. I see Tommy as the head strategic player in that duo, which is revealed by the boot order in the post-merge. Tommy and Lauren were aligned with each other, but they maintained secondary alliances outside their connection. When it came down to it, Lauren sacrificed many of her pawns in the early merge, like Aaron, Missy, and Elizabeth, while Tommy kept his around for the back half of the game. By the time they reached the final 6, every remaining contestant was more loyal to Tommy than Lauren. En route to that point, Tommy overcomes more adversity. In the split tribal, he's randomly thrown into a group where he's outnumbered 4-1 by the opposing Lyro alliance. If the Lyros take him out there, they walk into the final 9 with the numbers advantage. Yet Tommy is such a great social player that he convinces them to flip on their own and vote out Missy instead. That move gives Tommy's side the numbers. It's arguably the most important vote of the entire season. Tommy and Lauren then run the game between the final 9 and final 6. In that stretch, Tommy locks down a final 3 deal with Dan and Dean, where he easily would have won the season. That plan falls apart when Dan is ejected from the game at the final 6. I agree with production's decision to remove Dan, but from a strategic perspective, this was a massive blow for Tommy. Not only did Tommy lose a core ally, but that round pushes some of the bigger jury threats like Janet and Lauren deeper into the game. Tommy intended on taking out both of them earlier, but he was essentially forced into a tighter window. Without that ejection, Tommy votes out Janet at 6 and Lauren at 5. He would have sat in the final 4 with 3 allies who all intended on riding with him to the end. After the Dan boot, Tommy adapts again. He sets up a new final 3 deal with Dean and Nora. At final 5, he works with Dean in taking Janet out of the game by using an idol nullifier on her. Then at final 4, Nora wins final immunity. Earlier in the season, Nora promised to take Dean to the end, yet when it comes down to it, she decides to bring Tommy, which is insane. It shows just how well connected Tommy was with everyone on the island. Dean then defeats Lauren in firemaking, which is great for Tommy. The biggest knock for me against Tommy's game is the fact that Lauren has a good shot at beating him in a jury vote. I've ran this simulation in the past, but in that hypothetical final tribal between Lauren, Tommy, and Nora, it's a close battle that's probably decided by the jury votes of Jamal and Aaron. I don't know who wins that scenario, which is a negative for Tommy in that he reaches the final 4 with a potentially bigger jury threat. At the same time though, Tommy never intended on bringing Lauren to that point. He was forced to ride with her deeper into the season due to the Dan ejection. Tommy then defeats Dean and Nora in a 8-2-0 jury vote. There again, it's impressive that Tommy was able to navigate into a comfortable winning scenario despite so many luck-based events not breaking his way. Tommy's game on IOI is such a great win in that we see him dominate the game in multiple strategic positions. He plays from the top for most of the post-merge, and he plays from the bottom in that split tribal council. In my opinion, this win launches Tommy into an elite tier of Survivor players. I'll put him here at number 8. On to number 7, we can cover the other two-time winner on this list. Both of this contestant's wins ranked in the top 10. There was some debate over which game was more impressive, but for me, here at number 7, I got Tony Vlachos with his second win on Survivor Winners at War. Now, I understand that many people would rank Tony's win here at the number 1 spot, as it's arguably the most impressive winning game in the history of the show. Tony plays against the highest quality of competition that we've ever seen. 19 previous winners, many of which rank in my top 50 players. That alone skyrockets my opinion of Tony, the Survivor player, but when I look strictly at his navigation through the season, there are some rough points. The difficult aspect with this ranking is the origin of those blunders. Whenever Tony is poorly positioned or unable to achieve his ideal outcome, it's not due to any real strategic mistake on his end. Like Tommy, who I ranked at number 8, Tony is very unlucky on Winners at War. The Edge of Extinction twist constantly throws him into unlucky scenarios that weaken his strategic stranglehold on the season. For me, that loss of control is much less damning for Tony as it was facilitated by external factors, but it still happened. Tony, along with the rest of this cast, knew about the Edge of Extinction gimmick before filming, and I don't think that Tony played well around that component. At the end of the day, though, everything outside those last couple rounds where Natalie returns to the game is very impressive for Tony. He opens the season on the Dakal tribe where he's positioned on the periphery of the main power structure. He survives 2 tribal councils in that spot, but he is not the lead person directing the vote onto either Amber or Tyson. Tony's early game is a bit rocky in terms of strategic agency, but I will credit him for his threat level management. In the early pre-merge, many players were focused on breaking up dynamic duos. We see both the Natalie-Jeremy alliance and the Amber-Rob pairing separated in just the premiere. Tony walked into Winners at War with a clear number 1 ally in Sarah Lacina, positioned on the same tribe. Tony and Sarah are widely regarded as 2 of the most dominant winners in the history of the show, yet they're both able to fly under the radar through the first 4 episodes. Moving ahead to the swap, Tony attends the legendary Queenslayer Tribal Council, where Denise plays 2 idols. As a result, Tony is just one of 3 vulnerable contestants, yet no one writes his name down. In fact, Denise reported post-season that she had no intention of voting against Tony due to the relationship that he cultivated with her. It's a clear example of Tony working around external advantages through his social gameplay. We get to the merge, and this is where Tony really takes control, playing a more loyal version of his Cagayan game. He starts by picking off many of those players outside his main alliance, like Wendell, Adam, and Tyson. At Final 9, Tony pulls off potentially the most impressive strategic play in the history of the show. In that round, he correctly identifies Sophie as the player in the middle of the dominant alliance. He plans on gathering the votes against her, only for that scheme to be disrupted by the extortion disadvantage played against him by Natalie from the Edge of Extinction. Tony adapts accordingly, and he convinces 3 players to give him the fire tokens necessary to bypass the disadvantage. He then wins individual immunity and orchestrates the Sophie blindside, taking her out of the game through a plurality vote with an idol in her pocket. This move from Tony not only showcases his ability to overcome adversity on multiple fronts, but it positions him perfectly for the back half of the post-merge. By cutting Sophie and rebuilding his relationship with Sarah, Tony puts himself in the power seat. He's still got his core alliance with Sarah, Ben, and Denise, but he's also well connected with many of the peripheral players like Jeremy and Nick. Tony then dominates the game for the next couple rounds, cutting his biggest opposition in Kim at the final 8, followed by Jeremy at final 7 and Nick at final 6. Going into the final 5, Tony is set up perfectly to run the endgame. His original plan was to navigate to the final tribal alongside Ben and Sarah, where he easily wins a jury vote. That entire outlook is interrupted once again by the Edge of Extinction. Natalie returns to the game with an idol where she immediately paints a target on Tony's back. Keep in mind that Natalie just spent the last 30 plus days of the game with those jury members on the edge, so her perspective had a lot of credibility. Due to Natalie's return, Tony stumbles through those last 3 rounds. At Final 6, he correctly anticipates Natalie's possession of an idol, but he's unable to convince his alliance to split the vote. That forces Tony to sacrifice his own idol at Tribal Council, and he votes out Denise. Then at Final 5, he has the numbers in place to cut Michele, only for Ben to essentially quit the game. Ben advises Sarah to vote with Natalie and Michele against him as a way for her to build her resume and make a move that excludes Tony. Tony is left out of that plan, which is obviously bad. But I still see that Tribal Council as a round influenced by the edge of extinction. Without Natalie returning to the game and pointing the finger at Tony, Ben does not know that Sarah is underestimated by the jury, so he never has the motivation to give her this big move at Tribal Council. By the Final 4, Tony stands as the biggest jury threat on the board. Both Natalie and Michele intend on sending him into the fire-making challenge, which is not great. At the same time, according to postseason interviews, Sarah still wanted to ride with Tony to the end, which is insane given Natalie's comments from the edge. I think it's really impressive that Tony was able to keep that alliance intact despite Sarah receiving so many signals suggesting that she would lose to Tony. Tony then beats Sarah in fire-making, and he reaches the final tribal against Natalie and Michele, where he wins in a 12-4-0 jury vote. In terms of win equity, Tony was elite this season. I don't know if there was anyone in the late game that had a chance of beating him in a jury vote. So all in all, I look at Tony's winners at Wargame as a much improved version of Tommy's win on IOI. Both of them dominated their respective seasons, but they lost control at points due to external factors. While those low points are excusable, I can't look past them entirely. I'll put Tony here at number 7. Then at number 6, I got the same player. It's Tony Vlachos, this time with his first win on Survivor Cagayan. Tony's game on Season 28 is definitely one of the more chaotic and entertaining runs in Survivor history. Many people look at Cagayan as one of the best Survivor seasons, and I think that reputation stems in part from the gameplay of Tony. Unlike most other winners on this list, Tony runs the show from the middle. He's constantly flipping back and forth between alliances in a way that's only paralleled by Sarah Lacina, who we discussed earlier. Tony's Cagayan win is a personal favorite of mine, but there's still some minor flaws in this run. Initially, Tony is on the outside of the Braun tribe, but he's able to build connections with the likes of Trish, Sarah, and Wu. Had that group attended a tribal council in the early pre-merge, Tony had the numbers in place to knock out Cliff. At the swap, Tony accomplishes this goal of taking out Cliff in a move that serves to build new alliances with players outside the original Braun tribe. At the time, I know there was a lot of debate surrounding that decision from Tony, but through that move, Tony gains the trust of Jeffra and LJ. Both of them worked as essential allies for Tony in the next stage of the game. The merge of Cagayan is the low point of Tony's win, as his group elects to flip on the swing vote in Sarah Lacina. While Tony is included on that plan, he's not the one directing the ship. Cass is the head of that operation, and she elects to join Tony's side due to her relationship with Trish. It's also worth noting that Tony wastes his idol in that tribal council as he plays it on LJ, who receives 0 votes. That round is not great for Tony, but he dominates the rest of the season, beginning at the final 10. He starts by sticking with his original alliance and taking out Morgan, effectively reducing the Beauty tribe numbers. He then flips to knock out LJ, and in doing so, Tony solidifies his alliance with Wu. At Final 8, he flips back to his main group in voting out Jeremiah, and he follows that round with a third consecutive flip to take out Jeffra. That stretch between the Final 9 and Final 7 showcases some of the best strategic chops seen by any Survivor winner. At the same time, Tony is not navigating those situations by himself. He relies on the social work of Trish to help him rebuild those relationships. I know that some people discredit Tony's Cagayan game due to his dependence on Trish, but I think that you need to credit Tony for that relationship. Tony crosses Trish at the Final 7 in the Jeffra blind side, yet he's able to pull her back in and convince her to continue operating as his social facilitator. Through Tony's numerous flips in the mid-merge, he intentionally keeps those big jury threats like Spencer and Tasha as shields for later in the game. That strategy works out perfectly. Tasha is voted out at Final 6, while Spencer is sent home at Final 4. Tony's gameplay in that Spencer boot is really impressive as he lies and convinces the rest of the cast that his super idol was valid in that tribal council. You could argue that Tony's move there was somewhat facilitated by production-infused twists, but I don't see it that way because the idol itself was never actually played. You could also criticize Tony's decision to bring Spencer to the Final 4. The cast of Cagayan initially anticipated a 3-person Final Tribal Council format. Spencer was one immunity challenge away from that point where he likely defeats Tony in a jury vote. Tony then reaches his ideal endgame scenario against Wu and Cass, where had this season operated with a normal 3-person Final Tribal, Tony wins the whole thing. By pushing the Final Tribal back one round, Tony needs to find an alternative path to the end. Wu then wins final immunity, and the decision seems obvious. Wu should vote out Tony and take Cass to the end, where he would undoubtedly win the jury vote. This is where Tony does his best work of the entire season. He plays on Wu's morals of honor and integrity and manipulates him into taking Tony to the Final Tribal. The fact that Wu falls for this trick really shows Tony's ability to understand his competitors and cater his arguments accordingly. In the Final Tribal, Tony defeats Wu in a 8-1 jury vote, and I think that Tony wins most other Final Tribal Council combinations. So while there are some rough moments en route to the end for Tony, like his role in the Sarah boot and his arguments with Chaos Cass, he never faces any real consequences for those mistakes. He pulls off one of the most dynamic games in Survivor history, and he's in control every step of the way. He ranks here at number 6. Then at number 5, I got one of the most consistent winners on this list in terms of strategic agency. This player gains control on day 1 of his season, and he never takes his foot off the gas. It's Todd Herzog, the winner of Survivor China. Todd dominates this season with very little resistance. For this entire season, Todd is in the majority alliance, where he operates as a head strategic figure alongside his number 1 ally, Amanda Kimmel. Depending on your outlook on the Amanda-Todd dynamic, I could hear an argument for placing Todd in the co-dominant tier as opposed to this majority dominance tier. While yes, Amanda had influence in that pair's navigation through the season, I still look at Todd as the player with more strategic agency. I think that Todd was more outspoken in pushing the game towards his ideal Final Tribal Council scenario. He makes strategic maneuvers independent from Amanda, and he convinces Amanda to cut her secondary allies while Todd keeps Courtney for the late game. Jumping right in, Todd is immediately in the majority of the Fei Long tribe. He establishes this core 3-person alliance with Amanda and Aaron, and he intended on propping up Aaron as the figurehead to be taken out later in the game. In episode 3, he makes the cutthroat move of voting out Leslie after she shared her clue to the idol with him. Then at the swap, Todd has the insightful play of passing James an idol with the instructions of throwing the upcoming challenge to vote out Jamie. Obviously, there's some risk there in James potentially acquiring 2 idols for the post-merge. At the end of the day, though, I like this idea from Todd in that it ensures that the Fei Long Alliance enters the merge with the numbers advantage regardless of which side wins that last tribal challenge. Moving on to the merge, Todd continues to work in the power seat, voting out many of the peripheral players like Jamie, Jean-Robert, and Frosty. That Frosty boot was crucial to Todd's game in that it forced Courtney closer to him. Throughout that section of the early merge, Todd and Amanda come forward as a legitimate duo, yet they are never seriously targeted. Then we get to the final 7, where Todd and Amanda pull off the James blind side, voting him out with 2 idols in his pocket. Todd had the idea for the James boot earlier in the season, but I generally give more credit to Amanda for this move, as she was the one leading the charge against James in that particular round. It's also worth acknowledging that Todd receives a vote at that tribal council, and had James played one of his idols correctly, he's in serious danger of going home on the revote. The final 6 marks the point in the season where Todd's threat level peaks. From that point forward, Todd is the primary target of the minority alliance. He receives votes in every subsequent tribal council. That's not great, but I still need to credit Todd for his relationships within his main alliance. That collection of Denise, Courtney, and Amanda remain fully loyal to him even when those players on the bottom claim that Todd would win the season if he reached the end. Todd's influence over Denise at the final 6 is especially impressive. In that round, we see Denise admit on camera that if she sticks with Todd's alliance, she's number 4 on the totem pole. At the end of the day, Denise cares more about her loyalty to Todd than her positioning within the game, and she refuses to flip against him. That alliance runs the endgame, knocking out Eric, followed by PG. By the time Todd reaches the final 4, he has a guaranteed spot in the final tribal as long as Denise does not win final immunity. Even if Denise somehow won that last challenge, Todd had Courtney's vote in his pocket. In the worst case scenario, Todd at least gets a shot at reaching the end through a fire-making challenge. In reality, Amanda wins the last challenge of the season, and she elects to take Todd to the end over Denise, which is insane. We then get to the end game where Todd delivers, in my opinion, the greatest final tribal council speech in the history of the show. He wins the season in a 4-2-1 jury vote. I think that one major fault with Todd's game is the fact that he relies on that spectacular speech to win the season. Unlike many of the winners ahead of him, Todd's win on China was not locked when he walked into the final tribal. There were many undecided members of that jury, and while it's impressive that Todd was able to convince them that he played the best game, I still take issue with the tight margin of victory. So we covered Todd's win on Survivor China on the Survivor Analytics podcast around a year and a half ago. Going into that season, I knew that Todd played a dominant game, but that rewatch served to elevate my opinion of his win. I'll rank him here at number 5. Then at number 4, I got the second perfect game to appear on this list. It's John Cochran, the winner of Survivor Caramoan. I know that many people naturally compare Cochran's perfect game on Caramoan and JT's perfect game on Tocantins, but I think that Cochran's win is more impressive by a solid margin. Yes, there are parallels between those wins. Both JT and Cochran vote in the majority alliance for the entire season. They both lock down a number 1 ally who they outplay and defeat in the final tribal council. The big factor that pushes Cochran ahead of JT for me is the fact that Cochran's number 1 actually wanted to ride with him to the end game. That was not the case for JT. But jumping right in, Cochran enters this season on the Favorites tribe, where he's immediately a part of the majority Stealth R Us alliance. The show paints Philip as the leader of that group, but to be honest, I have a difficult time believing that he was actually the head of that alliance. I see Philip more as the figurehead, while contestants like Cochran, Dawn, Malcolm, and Corinne actually ran things behind the scenes. Moving on to the merge, Cochran and Dawn are active in directing the vote onto Corinne at Final 12. That move not only established a new majority alliance, but it solidified Cochran and Dawn's bond with Sherry, who they later roll with to the final tribal. At Final 10, you get the historic Three Amigos Tribal Council, where every player on the bottom has individual immunity. That round is the only point all season where Cochran does not directly vote against the player who goes home. Even in Cochran's worst tribal council, he's still in the majority alliance, and he loses control only due to production-infused advantages. After that move, Cochran immediately regains control, and the rest of his game is straight-up dominance. He starts by picking off those players on the bottom, in Malcolm followed by Reynolds. At Final 7, Cochran recognizes that he's not a part of Andrea's long-term plan, and he orchestrates her blind side. Then at Final 6, he leads the vote against Brenda, which is the clearest example of Cochran outplaying Dawn. Through that point in the season, Brenda was much closer to Dawn than Cochran on both a strategic and personal level. By convincing Dawn to flip on Brenda, Cochran limits Dawn's paths to the end, and he sours the jury against her. Later on at the final tribal, we see Brenda literally force Dawn to take out her partial denture because she's so angry. It's the best strategic move in Cochran's entire Survivor career. From that point, Cochran runs the endgame alongside Dawn and Sherry, but there are external factors impacting those last couple rounds. Eric gets medically evacuated at Final 5. Some people claim that if Eric wasn't pulled from the game, then Cochran doesn't win the season, and I just don't buy into that hypothetical. Eric was the consensus target for the Final 5, and even if he won individual immunity there, I don't see him gathering the numbers against Cochran. I doubt that either Dawn or Sherry would be willing to flip against him. Then at Final 4, Cochran wins individual immunity and they take out Eddie. When Cochran sits in the end against Sherry and Dawn, it's not even close. He earns all 8 jury votes, and I think that Cochran wins most other Final Tribal Council scenarios. The jury of Caramoan absolutely loved him. I look at Cochran's run here as one of the best social games in the history of the show. Now, when it comes to Cochran's social game, we need to acknowledge the surrounding cast. Survivor Caramoan is infamous partially for the amount of pre-gaming leading up to filming. Cochran had a lot of outside-the-game friends on this cast. I get it if you want to knock Cochran on the basis of the quality of his competition, but that's not really something that I factor into these rankings. Plus, every returning player season features some degree of pre-gaming. So like I said at the beginning, I see Cochran's Karamoan run as the best perfect game of Survivor. It's a game where he's always in control with legitimate win equity, all while completely avoiding the target. I'll rank Cochran here at number 4. Moving on to the top 3, I can introduce the final tier of this list called Complete Dominance. These are the players who ran their seasons from beginning to end. They're the head strategic figures of their respective alliances, and they open multiple pathways to the final tribal through their strategic play. These winners reach the end of their seasons with loyal allies, and they obliterate their competition in a jury vote. I think there's a solid gap in the quality of the wins between this tier and the ones below. So at number 3, I got Boston Rob Mariano with his run on Survivor Redemption Island. Rob's degree of control on this season is unlike anything that we've ever seen. He takes control of the numbers early, and he steamrolls the rest of the game until he ends up in his ideal final tribal council scenario. Redemption Island is remembered as one of the worst seasons in the history of the show, and I think that's in part due to the dominance of Boston Rob. He never faces any real adversity en route to the win. From the beginning, Rob has the numbers on his side, and he leads the first couple Ometepe tribal councils, picking off many of those players who actively opposed him. Francesca and Christina were the most vocal against Rob's alliance, so it's no surprise that both of them go home in the early game. At the merge, Rob pulls off his best move of the season. Matt returns from Redemption Island, and he considers flipping against Rob's alliance. In the end, he stays loyal to Rob, but Rob's group still votes him out. It's an incredible play on multiple fronts. It causes the opposing Zapatera tribe to burn their idol, leaving them powerless for the rest of the season. It maintains the loyal Ometepe numbers 6-5 for the following round, so they're still primed to control the game. Most importantly, it sends a message to the rest of Rob's alliance that he would vote them out if they even considered going against him. That Ometepe group is extremely loyal to Rob through the merge, and I think that the Matt vote played a large role in it. After the Matt boot, Rob runs Redemption Island like an old school season. He picks off every member from the Zapatera tribe for 5 straight rounds. During that stretch, there's a couple points where the Zapateras attempt and fail to gather the numbers against Rob, which is not great. When the numbers dwindle to just that Ometepe alliance, Rob identifies his ideal endgame scenario against Philip and Natalie. He works towards that destination by picking off some of the stronger physical competitors like Andrea and Grant. Andrea then returns to the game at the final 5, where she attempts to rally people against Boston Rob. She tells them that Rob would win in the end, yet they still vote her out. At Final 4, Rob wins final immunity, which opens the door for his group to knock out Ashley. Rob then wins the season against Natalie and Philip in a 8-1-0 jury vote. Natalie and Philip are both widely regarded as 2 of the worst finalists in the history of the show, so it's impressive that Rob was able to drag both of them to the end. It's a clean and dominant route to the final tribal. I genuinely considered bumping Rob up due to the sheer amount of control he maintains on this season. But similar to Brian Heidick, who we talked about at number 10, Rob had a horrible social game. He was perceived as the mob boss of that Ometepe group. He forces the 2 groups to sleep in different shelters and eat at separate times. He creates the buddy system, which prevents people in his alliance from strategizing with the opposition. Those are effective tactics in keeping Rob in power, but they also cause the Zapatera players to hate him. Yes, Rob wins the season handily against Philip and Natalie, but I think he loses most other Final Tribal Council scenarios. He more than likely loses to Ashley, meaning she was just 1 immunity challenge away from destroying Rob's entire strategic masterclass. That poor social play meant that there were just tight margins of error for Rob. The 2 winners ranked ahead of him may have held a bit less control, but they win their seasons against practically anyone in the endgame. So I don't know if we'll ever see a winner as powerful as Boston Rob. I'll rank him here at number 3. Then at number 2, I got a player who, like Rob, ran his season the entire way through. This contestant separates himself from Rob through both his jury management and his ability to overcome adversity in the game. It's Earl Cole, the winner of Survivor Fiji. If you watch my player ranking series, then you know that I put Earl in my top 10 contestants of all time, despite him only appearing on 1 season. This winning game is just that impressive. It's a game where Earl is always positioned as the head strategic force of his alliance, yet he's never seriously targeted. His name is written down just one time the entire season, and that vote was a throwaway from Rita in the pre-merge. Keep in mind that Earl never won individual immunity on Fiji. He was vulnerable at every tribal council, yet he was so well insulated socially that no one ever considered flipping against him. From strictly a positioning perspective, this is the greatest game of Survivor. Earl walks into Fiji as a member of the Have-Nots tribe that loses the first 3 immunity challenges. As his tribe slowly starts apart, Earl is working in the majority, where he locks down his primary allies in Yao-Man and Michelle. Later on at the swap, Earl is thrown into a group where the numbers are evenly split 3-3 according to original tribal lines. While that group never attends a tribal council, Earl takes that opportunity to build relationships with the likes of Cassandra, Boo, and Stacy. By the merge, those 3 contestants were more loyal to Earl and Yao-Man than their original tribe. Now, it's important to recognize that those connections were not solely facilitated in this section of the game. Survivor Fiji opened with a strange twist where all of the players resided on the same beach for the first day. During that time, Earl aligned with the contestants working to build the shelter, as well as the black players on the cast. Earl's game on Season 14 is nearly perfect, but I'll admit that he definitely benefits from that twist in the premiere. It's one of the few minor knocks against his resume. Later on in Episode 9, production includes a second tribe swap that snipes Michelle, Earl's second closest ally, out of the game. It's an incredibly unlucky scenario for Earl that never actually disrupts his strategic stranglehold on the season. We get to the merge where Earl maintains the 5-4 numbers advantage over the Four Horsemen's alliance. He does some very impressive work in that merge vote. Greens tells Earl that the minority alliance holds an idol, and Earl responds by leading the charge against Edgardo, the player least likely to receive that idol at Tribal Council. I also respect Earl's idea to tell Dreams the incorrect target. That move serves to test Dreams' loyalty, and it provides an extra layer of protection in the event that Dreams leak that intel back to the Four Horsemen. With Edgardo out of the game, Earl's side dominates the next couple rounds, picking off the remnants of the Four Horsemen in Mookie, followed by Alex. We get to the final 6, which is probably Earl's worst round of the season. He is technically excluded from the consensus plan against Yao-Man, who ends up staying in the game through an idol play. Earl was completely blindsided by the original vote, which is obviously bad, but that doesn't mean that Earl was on the bottom. Every other player in the game still wanted to ride with Earl to the end, they just didn't want Yao-Man by his side. Honestly, even if Yao-Man is voted out at 6, Earl still runs the endgame alongside Dreams and Cassandra. After the Stacy boot at 6, Earl dominates the last couple rounds, voting out Boo, then Yao-Man. Earl's threat level management in that stretch is absolutely incredible. Despite standing as the biggest jury threat on the board, no one ever attempts to vote him out. Even in the Tribal Council where Yao-Man goes home, he votes against Cassandra, not Earl. I know that the common criticism against Earl is that Yao-Man would have defeated him in the end, but I completely disagree. Yao-Man himself admitted postseason that he had no chance at beating Earl. When you look at that hypothetical final tribal between Earl and Yao-Man, I think that Earl has at least 5 locked jury votes, which automatically gives him the win. I doubt that Earl sweeps the jury in that scenario, but it's a win regardless. I'd also credit Earl for his identification of Yao-Man as the biggest jury threat at Final 4, as well as his willingness to cut Yao-Man there. In reality, Earl faces off against Dreams and Cassandra in the final tribal, where he receives all 9 jury votes. Overall, I look at Earl's win on Fiji as the best social game in the history of the show. Now, I think there's an argument for placing Rob ahead of Earl on the basis of strategic dominance, but I'd prefer Earl's game where he maintains slightly less control, but much more safety and win equity. I'll rank him here at number 2. We've made it to the number 1 spot. When I'm honest, this selection was not particularly close. I kind of knew going into this project that this player would rank at the top, and no other winners seriously challenged this game. It's Kim Spradlin with her run on Survivor One World. Kim's win on Season 24 is the most complete game of Survivor. She's firing on all cylinders here. Strategically, Kim is the head strategic figure directing votes for the entire season. Socially, she's adored by the rest of the One World cast to the point where she's rarely targeted, and I think she beats anyone from the post-merge in a jury vote. Then even physically, Kim ties the women's record for most individual immunity wins on a single season. I look at Kim as the second best Survivor player of all time, and that opinion largely stems from this winning game. From the beginning, Kim positions herself as the strategic pillar of the women's tribe. She builds this stable 5-person majority with many of the stronger physical players. Within that alliance, Kim locks down her core allies of Sabrina and Chelsea, both of whom appeared more loyal to Kim than each other. That alliance later runs the post-merge, so I need to credit Kim as the architect of that group. At the swap, Kim establishes a secret alliance with many of the former members of the men's tribe like Jay, Troyzan, and Michael. Those connections offer Kim a lot of safety and strategic flexibility in the back half of the game. At the merge, we initially see 2 larger competing alliances, but the truth was that Kim sat as the strategic pin of both groups. She then convinces the men to knock out one of their peripheral allies in Jonas, which gives the women the 6-5 numbers advantage in the following round. From there, Kim's side starts to pick off the men for 4 straight tribal councils, and she has some impressive plays in that stretch. At Final 11, she tricks the guys into taking out Michael, and while that move officially ends her swap tribe alliance, it also ensures that the women maintain a comfortable majority. At Final 10, Kim faces her only real adversity all season, where Troyzan comes up with this plan of idling her out of the game. Once again, though, Kim's connections pay off. Jay leaks this information back to Kim, and she has the killer instinct to flip the vote onto Jay himself, knowing that Troyzan will burn his idol at Tribal Council. That move essentially destroys the men's last hopes of flipping the game in their favor, and we see Leaf and Troyzan voted out back-to-back. We get to the final 7, and by this point in the season, Kim has the game basically locked and won. Every remaining player wanted to ride with her to the end, and she crushes any of them in a jury vote. She votes out Kat at 7, as she was the least trusted member of that women's alliance. Then at Final 6, Kim does her best work of the season in duping Alicia into thinking that Tarzan was the real strategic mastermind of the post-merge. Alicia had a chance at winning a jury vote against Tarzan and Christina, but she was blinded by her loyalty to Kim. By cutting Tarzan at 6, Kim positions herself perfectly for the endgame. Going into the Final 5, there were 2 Final 3 deals in place, both of which involved Kim. On one side, Kim had 2 of the most hated members of the Women's Alliance in Alicia and Christina, and on the other, she had her Day 1 allies in Sabrina and Chelsea. Now, Kim ultimately elects to roll with her original allies to the final tribal, and I think that move deserves some level of criticism. Kim potentially wins the season unanimously against the other pair, but it doesn't really matter. Even against Sabrina and Chelsea, 2 of the more well-respected players of Kim's alliance, she still wins the game handily, receiving 7 out of 9 jury votes. Kim connected with the jury of One World in a way that we rarely see on Survivor. While Troyzan and Leaf felt some bitterness towards her, everyone else loved Kim. And I bet she wins comfortably in just about every final tribal council scenario. There's only 2 real drawbacks that I see with Kim's game. The first is her relationships with Troyzan and Leaf. Neither of them vote for her in the final tribal, and Troyzan attempts to gather the numbers against her on 2 occasions. The second common criticism against Kim is the quality of competition on One World, but as I've said throughout this list, that's not really a factor that I include in my rankings, as it's something completely outside of Kim's control. So I feel that Kim's win on One World is the closest thing that we've seen to a truly perfect game of Survivor. Kim combines many of the best attributes of the winners in these top tiers. She's as well positioned as Earl on Fiji, she has as much control as Boston Rob on Redemption Island, and she has the win equity of Tony on Winners at War. To me, it's clearly the best winning game in the history of Survivor. So there it is, my complete ranking of every winning game of US Survivor. If you followed along with this series over the past month, thank you so much for your support. Keep following Survivor Analytics, where we will cover 3 seasons of Survivor per year. I also release a player ranking for each of those seasons, and let me know what kind of larger rankings you want to see on this page next. But again, thank you so much for listening.